Cowboys feared rattlesnakes and outlaws, but there was something smaller that killed more settlers than bullets ever did. While you're swatting mosquitoes with modern repellent, pioneers had a secret weapon that sounds absolutely insane today. What they did to survive bug season will make you question everything about frontier toughness. Life in the Wild West wasn't just about gunfights and cattle rustling. Every single day brought a battle most Hollywood movies never show you: the constant war against bugs. Millions of tiny six-legged enemies crawled, buzzed, and bit their way through frontier life, making settlers miserable in ways that would drive modern people absolutely insane. Flies swarmed everything. They covered food the moment you set it down. They landed on your face while you slept. Open a pot of beans, and within seconds you'd have 20 flies diving into your dinner. Makes sense when you think about it. No refrigeration, no screens, and plenty of horse manure everywhere meant paradise for flies, but it meant hell for anyone trying to eat a meal in peace. Mosquitoes turned summer evenings into torture sessions. Swarms so thick they looked like grey clouds would descend on settlements, especially near rivers and streams. People couldn't sit outside without getting eaten alive. Children woke up covered in welts, their faces swollen from bites, and the noise, that constant high-pitched whining that drove people half crazy during the humid months. Then there were the lice. Nearly everyone had them. Rich, poor, clean or dirty. Lice didn't discriminate. They lived in hair, in clothing, in bedding. Families spent hours each week picking through each other's hair with fine combs, hunting for the tiny parasites. The itching was unbearable, and the social stigma was worse. Well, actually there wasn't much stigma because everyone dealt with the same problem. Fleas jumped from person to person, from animals to humans, spreading faster than gossip in a small town. They hid in floor cracks, in furniture, in anything made of fabric or wood. One infested visitor could turn an entire household into a scratching, miserable mess within days. Dogs and cats brought them in constantly, but families couldn't afford to get rid of their animals. They needed them for other pest control duties. But here's where it gets really nasty. These weren't just annoying little creatures causing itchy bumps. Bugs carried diseases that could wipe out entire families. Mosquitoes spread malaria and yellow fever. Flies carried typhoid from outhouses to dinner tables. Lice transmitted typhus during outbreaks that closed down whole towns. The tiny pests were literally deadly. Food storage became a nightmare when beetles, weevils and moths decided to move in. Open a sack of flour and find it crawling with larvae. There goes your bread for the month. Weevils turned beans into hollow shells filled with bug droppings. Moths ate holes through stored grain until it looked like Swiss cheese. Families could lose their entire winter food supply to insects, which meant potential starvation. Living spaces offered almost no protection. Log cabins had gaps between the logs where thousands of bugs could hide and breed. Dirt floors provided perfect nesting spots for crawling insects. Single-room cabins meant nowhere to escape when the pests got really bad. Families often slept outside during the worst infestations, choosing to risk wild animals rather than deal with the bugs indoors. The seasonal cycles made everything worse. Spring brought clouds of gnats and emerging mosquitoes. Summer meant flies, wasps and biting midges. Fall delivered spiders and beetles looking for warm places to spend winter. Even winter wasn't bug-free. Lice and fleas thrived in the warm, crowded conditions when families huddled together for months. Children suffered the worst. Their tender skin attracted more bites, and they couldn't resist scratching until they bled. Infected scratches led to serious illness in an era before antibiotics. Many frontier kids spent their entire childhoods covered in bug bites, scabs, and the constant discomfort of tiny tormentors. Women bore the brunt of pest control duties on top of everything else. They swept, scrubbed and fought bugs while cooking, cleaning and raising children. Laundry day meant boiling clothes to kill lice and fleas. Meal preparation required constant vigilance against flies landing on food. Every household chore included a pest management component. And the weird part is, people just accepted it as normal life. Letters and diaries from the era mention bug problems casually, like discussing the weather. They developed incredible tolerance for discomfort that would send modern people running to the nearest hotel. The economic impact was staggering too. Crop losses to grasshoppers, beetles and caterpillars could bankrupt entire communities overnight. Store owners lost merchandise to moths and weevils. Livestock weakened by constant bug attacks produced less milk and meat. This daily siege by insects forced settlers to become incredibly creative problem solvers. They couldn't just call an exterminator or buy bug spray at the corner store. Every family had to develop their own survival strategies, learning through trial and error which methods actually worked against their tiny tormentors. The solutions they invented would surprise you. Some worked brilliantly, others barely helped, but all of them show the desperate ingenuity of people who refused to let bugs drive them off their land. Their first priority became crystal clear: protecting the one thing that meant life or death on the frontier. Food storage in the Wild West wasn't just about convenience, it was literally about life and death. One bad weevil infestation could turn your winter wheat into worthless powder. One beetle invasion could leave your family staring at empty grain barrels while snow piled up outside. Weevils were the silent assassins of frontier pantries. These tiny beetles would slip into grain sacks through holes smaller than a pinhead. Once inside, they'd lay eggs directly in wheat kernels, corn and rice. The larvae would eat their way out from the inside, leaving behind nothing but hollow shells and bug droppings. A single female weevil could produce over 400 offspring in her lifetime. Do the math on that nightmare. Flower beetles were just as ruthless. They'd turn perfectly good flour into a crawling, moving mass of insects and larvae. Families would open their precious flour barrels to find them teeming with tiny brown beetles. The flour would taste bitter and smell musty. Even worse, the beetles could chew through cloth sacks and thin wood. Nothing was truly safe. Then there were the grain moths. These weren't your typical clothes moths fluttering around a lamp. Grain moths were specialized food destroyers. They'd lay eggs in stored beans, cornmeal, and dried fruit. The caterpillars would spin silky webs throughout the food, binding everything together in a disgusting, inedible mess. Families would discover their winter bean supply wrapped in thick webbing, crawling with fat white worms. But here's the thing that really made settlers desperate. Food loss wasn't just about being hungry for a day or two. Most frontier families had one major harvest per year. They'd spend months growing, harvesting, and preparing their food stores for winter. If bugs destroyed those supplies, there was no grocery store to visit, no backup plan. You either found a way to get more food or you starved. Mice made the problem 10 times worse. They'd chew holes in grain sacks, creating perfect entry points for insects. A mouse hole in a flour barrel was like rolling out the red carpet for every weevil in the county. Settlers would wake up to find their food stores compromised from multiple directions at once. The really maddening part was how quickly infestations could spread. One contaminated sack of grain could infect an entire winter's worth of supplies within weeks. Bugs would move from container to container, multiplying faster than families could eat their way through the good food. Some settlers described opening their root cellars to find clouds of grain beetles rising from every single storage container. Smart pioneers learned to inspect everything obsessively. They'd run grain through their fingers, looking for tiny holes that meant weevil eggs. They'd smell flour for that telltale musty odor that signaled beetle activity. Some families would spread thin layers of grain on white cloth, making it easier to spot moving insects. But detection was only half the battle. Once bugs moved in, getting rid of them was nearly impossible with frontier tools. Heat could kill insects, but most settlers couldn't afford to fire up ovens hot enough for long enough to treat large quantities of grain. Cold worked too, but winter temperatures weren't always reliable for killing every last egg and larva. Some desperate families would sift their flour through fine mesh, trying to separate the bugs from the food. Others would skim weevils off the top of grain barrels and hope for the best. The most practical settlers learned to cook everything thoroughly, figuring extra protein from a few bugs was better than no food at all. Storage became an obsession. Families would hunt for the coolest, driest spots in their homes and dugouts. Root cellars were ideal, but not everyone had access to good underground storage. Some buried ceramic crocks or metal containers, hoping underground temperatures would slow insect reproduction. Applied storage was the holy grail, but nearly impossible to achieve. Glass jars worked for small quantities but were expensive and fragile. Metal containers were better but costly. Most families made do with wooden barrels, ceramic crocks, and cloth sacks, knowing they were fighting a losing battle against determined bugs. The psychological toll was brutal too. Imagine working all summer to grow and harvest your family's food supply, only to watch insects slowly destroy it throughout the winter. Parents would lie awake at night, literally listening for the sounds of bugs chewing through their provisions. Some settlements tried community approaches. Families would pool resources for large metal storage containers, or take turns guarding shared food supplies. But individual families were mostly on their own against the bug army. The worst years were when multiple pest problems hit simultaneously. A mouse invasion, followed by weevil infestations, followed by grain moths, could wipe out food stores completely. These were the seasons that broke families, forcing them to abandon homesteads or move to towns where they could work for food instead of growing it. Smart settlers quickly realized that protecting food meant protecting everything else. But keeping bugs out of your grain barrels was only the beginning. Next came the bigger challenge: keeping pests out of where you actually lived. When you're living in a one-room log cabin with gaps between the logs wide enough to stick your finger through, keeping bugs out becomes a daily battle. Pioneer families quickly learned that their homes were basically five-star hotels for every crawling, flying, and biting creature within miles. The first line of defense: fill every crack you could find. Settlers mixed mud with clay, grass, and whatever else they could get their hands on to seal up their cabins. Some folks got creative and stuffed moss into the gaps between logs. Others used a mixture called chinking, basically mud, sticks, and stones mashed together. It wasn't pretty, but it worked better than leaving highways for ants and beetles to march right into your living space. Then there's the challenge of sleeping without getting eaten alive. Families who could afford it hung mosquito netting around their beds, but most pioneers had to make do with whatever cloth they could spare. Old sheets, worn-out clothing, even feed sacks got turned into makeshift bed curtains. Kids often slept under thin cotton covers, even in sweltering summer heat, because the alternative was waking up covered in mosquito bites. Doors and windows stayed shut whenever possible, which made summer nights absolutely miserable. But leaving them open meant inviting every moth, beetle, and bloodsucker in the territory to join the family for dinner. Some families tried hanging wet blankets over doorways to create a barrier, but that only worked until the fabric dried out. Well, things started changing in the late 1800s when window screens began showing up in frontier towns. These weren't the fancy metal screens we know today. Early screens were made from cheesecloth, fine wire mesh, or even hair from horses and cattle woven together. The wealthy folks in bigger settlements could order proper wire screening from back east, but most families had to get creative with whatever materials they could find locally. But why stop at windows? Smart settlers started screening their porches and even building screened-in cooking areas. Makes sense, right? You're trying to prepare food while swatting flies every few seconds. Having a bug-free kitchen space was like striking gold. The weird part is how much thought went into something as simple as floor height. Pioneers discovered that raising their cabins off the ground by even a foot or two made a huge difference in keeping out crawling pests. Ants, beetles, and other ground-dwelling insects had a much harder time reaching elevated floors. Some families built their homes on stone foundations or wooden posts specifically to create this barrier. Let's not forget the constant maintenance involved in pest-proofing a frontier home. Those mud and moss chinks between logs, they cracked and fell out regularly. Families spent hours every few weeks resealing their walls, especially after heavy rains or harsh winters. It was like painting a house, except instead of improving appearance, you were literally keeping your sanity intact by stopping the bug invasion. Clever home builders started incorporating pest control right into their construction plans. They'd leave certain logs slightly overlapping to reduce gap sizes. Some built double walls with space in between, figuring bugs might get trapped in the middle section instead of making it all the way inside. Others angled their roof lines to prevent water from pooling anywhere near the house. Standing water meant mosquito nurseries, and the lengths people went to for a good night's sleep were remarkable. Entire families would sometimes abandon their beds during particularly bad mosquito seasons and sleep on tables, chairs, or even outside under heavy blankets. Children learned to tuck their clothes tightly around their bodies before bed, creating makeshift armor against nighttime biters. Door frames got special attention too. Settlers would pack extra mud or clay around door jambs and threshold areas where gaps were most likely to form. Some hung heavy curtains just inside their front doors, creating a double barrier system. Others built small enclosed entryways, like primitive airlocks, so bugs couldn't rush inside every time someone opened the main door. But here's what's really fascinating. These home modifications weren't just about comfort. Keeping insects out could literally mean the difference between life and death when disease-carrying mosquitoes or flies were involved. Families who successfully bug-proofed their homes often stayed healthier through fever seasons that devastated their neighbors. The evolution of pest-resistant housing happened fast once word spread about what worked. Successful techniques got copied and improved by other families. Within a few years, entire settlements would adopt similar building methods based on what proved most effective against local bug populations. However, even the best sealed cabin couldn't keep everything out, which is exactly why pioneers had to get creative with what they could control inside their homes, starting with protecting the one thing that meant survival itself. When settlers ran out of store-bought solutions, they turned to what nature provided right outside their cabin doors. The frontier demanded creativity, and pioneers quickly discovered that certain plants could wage war against bugs just as effectively as any manufactured product. These natural repellents weren't fancy, but they worked when you needed them most. Mint became a household hero across the Wild West. Families would crush fresh mint leaves and scatter them around doorways, windowsills, and sleeping areas. The strong scent that humans found refreshing made ants, mice, and flies think twice about entering. Smart settlers planted mint patches near their homes, creating natural barriers that kept renewing themselves. The bonus: you could brew mint tea while keeping pests away. Then there's tansy, a yellow-flowered plant that pioneers called bitter buttons. This hardy herb grew wild across much of the frontier, and experienced settlers knew to gather it by the armload. They'd hang dried tansy bundles from cabin rafters or stuff it into small cloth bags placed under mattresses. Fleas absolutely hated the smell. One old-timer's trick involved boiling tansy leaves to create a wash for dogs and livestock, though you had to be careful. Too much tansy could poison animals. Lavender earned its reputation as the gentleman's pest fighter. Unlike some harsh-smelling repellents, lavender actually made homes smell pleasant while driving away moths, fleas, and mosquitoes. Women would sew small sachets filled with dried lavender flowers and tuck them between bedsheets, in clothing chests, and even inside pillowcases. The delicate purple flowers were worth their weight in gold to families plagued by fabric-eating insects. But here's where things get interesting, and a bit desperate. When gentle herbs weren't enough, settlers turned to burning remedies that created thick, choking smoke. Cedar bark was a favorite choice. Families would gather strips of cedar and toss them onto their fires during mosquito season. The aromatic smoke would drift through cabins and around outdoor areas, creating temporary bug-free zones. Cedar smoke worked so well that some families kept special cedar fires burning in metal pans outside their doors during summer evenings. Sage burning became almost ritual-like in certain regions. Prairie settlers discovered that native sage plants, when dried and burned, produced a distinctive smoke that mosquitoes and gnats couldn't tolerate. They'd light bundles of dried sage and walk around their property, creating smoke clouds that provided hours of relief. Native American tribes had used this method for generations, and smart pioneers learned to copy their techniques. Well, let's talk about the less glamorous burning option: cow dung. Fresh manure obviously smelled terrible and attracted flies, but dried cow chips told a different story. When burned, they created a slow, steady smoke that actually repelled flying insects. Frontier families would collect dried dung, store it like firewood, and burn it in special containers placed strategically around their property. The smell wasn't pleasant for humans either, but when you're being eaten alive by mosquitoes, even cow dung smoke starts looking pretty good. Plant-based oils offered more targeted relief for individual family members. Settlers would crush aromatic leaves and rub the oils directly onto their skin. Peppermint oil worked against mosquitoes and black flies. Wild garlic, when rubbed on exposed skin, kept many biting insects at bay. Some families discovered that crushing pennyroyal leaves and applying the oil to clothing and bedding helped prevent flea infestations. The weird part is how effective these simple remedies actually were. Modern science has since proven that many of these plants contain natural compounds that genuinely repel insects. Mint contains menthol, lavender has linalool, and cedar produces natural insecticides. The pioneers didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood results. Families often combined multiple natural repellents for maximum effectiveness. A typical summer evening might involve scattering mint leaves around the cabin, burning sage outside the windows, and rubbing peppermint oil on children's arms and legs before bedtime. These layered approaches created multiple barriers that insects had to overcome. Storage became crucial for maintaining year-round supplies. Experienced settlers would harvest herbs during peak growing season and spend considerable time drying, bundling, and storing them properly. Root cellars and dry attics became treasure troves of dried lavender, mint, tansy, and sage. Smart families treated their herb supplies like they treated their food stores, carefully rationed and jealously guarded. Some herbs served double duty as both pest repellents and medicine. Tansy helped with stomach problems when brewed correctly. Lavender soothed headaches and helped people sleep. Mint aided digestion. This multipurpose approach meant families could justify the time and effort spent gathering and preparing natural repellents. Regional variations developed based on local plant availability. Desert settlers relied heavily on sage and creosote bush. Mountain families used pine needles and cedar. Prairie dwellers had access to wild mint and various flowering plants. Each region developed its own pest-fighting traditions using whatever nature provided locally. But what happened when natural repellents weren't enough? When swarms of insects overwhelmed even the most carefully prepared herbal defenses? That's when settlers had to get creative with fire, smoke, and some truly ingenious smoking techniques that could clear entire buildings of pests. Filling cracks in cabin walls was one thing, but when evening rolled around and mosquitoes descended like tiny vampires, settlers needed something more aggressive. Enter the mighty power of smoke. Nothing made bugs scatter faster than a thick, choking cloud billowing from a well-positioned fire. Campfires became the frontier's first line of defense against flying pests. But these weren't your cozy marshmallow roasting affairs. Settlers built what they called smudge fires, deliberately smoky, often smelly blazes designed to create maximum irritation for insects. The worse it smelled to humans, the better it worked on bugs. Makes sense, right? The timing mattered enormously. Just before dusk, when mosquitoes and gnats stirred to life, families would light their smudge pots and position them strategically around their homes. Windows on the upwind side stayed open to let smoke drift through the cabin, while downwind openings were sealed tight. Within minutes, the air inside became so thick with smoke that even the hungriest mosquito gave up and searched for easier targets elsewhere. What went into these fires would make modern environmentalists cringe. Fresh cow dung was a favorite fuel. It burned slowly and produced dense, acrid smoke that insects absolutely hated. Green wood worked well too, especially if it was damp enough to smolder rather than flame. Cedar bark, sage, and even old rags soaked in bacon grease found their way into the mix. The goal wasn't a clean burn, it was maximum smoke production. Then there were the more creative additions. Some settlers swore by adding old leather scraps or worn-out boots to their smudge fires. Others tossed in handfuls of wet leaves or grass. One popular trick involved burning dried horse manure mixed with pine needles. Apparently the combination created a particularly offensive smell that sent bugs fleeing for miles. Barns and chicken coops got the smoke treatment too, but with different techniques. Farmers would seal up these buildings as tightly as possible, then introduce smoke through small openings until the interior became nearly impenetrable. They called this smoking out the structure, and it could clear everything from flies to mites in a single session. The animals had to be moved out first, naturally, but the results were worth the extra work. Portable smudge pots became essential equipment for anyone working outdoors during bug season. These small metal containers, often made from old tin cans, could be carried to fields, loading areas, or anywhere else people needed temporary relief from biting insects. Cowboys on cattle drives kept smudge pots burning around their camps every evening, creating smoke barriers that let them eat dinner without being devoured alive. The weird part is how scientific settlers became about their smoke production. Different materials produced different types of smoke, and experienced frontier families knew exactly which combination worked best for their particular pest problems. Mosquitoes hated one blend, while flies responded better to another. Some even kept detailed notes about which fuels burned longest or produced the thickest clouds. Indoor smoking required careful planning. Too much smoke could suffocate the family. Too little left gaps for insects to exploit. Settlers learned to create gentle drafts that pulled smoke through living spaces without making them completely uninhabitable. Children were often stationed at windows and doors, adjusting openings to control airflow and smoke density. But smoke worked best in still, enclosed spaces where it could linger and build up concentration. Windy nights were disasters for smudge fire defense. The smoke scattered before it could do any good, leaving families exposed to renewed insect attacks. On those nights, people retreated indoors and hoped their cabin sealing efforts would hold. Some communities organized group smoking sessions during particularly bad outbreaks. Neighbors would coordinate their fires, creating massive smoke clouds that covered entire settlements. These community efforts were especially important during grasshopper invasions, or when disease-carrying mosquitoes threatened public health. Professional teamsters and freight haulers developed portable smoking rigs that could protect both cargo and workers during long journeys. These mobile setups allowed them to create protective smoke zones wherever they stopped for the night, ensuring that valuable goods stayed pest-free and crews could rest without constant harassment from biting insects. The technique even extended to food storage areas. Root cellars and pantries were periodically smoked out to kill any insects that had managed to infiltrate stored supplies. This required removing all food first, then introducing dense smoke for several hours before ventilating and restocking. While smoke provided crucial relief from flying pests, settlers discovered that their four-legged friends could be equally valuable allies in the never-ending war against bugs. Dogs and cats weren't just companions. They were working partners in pest control efforts that often proved more effective than any amount of smoldering cow dung. Smoke might have kept mosquitoes at bay, but settlers quickly learned that four-legged helpers could wage war against pests in ways no campfire ever could. Animals became the unsung heroes of frontier pest control, working around the clock to keep homes, barns, and food supplies safe from invaders. To the best part, these living pest controllers didn't need matches, fuel, or constant supervision. Cats ruled the roost when it came to protecting precious food stores. A single barn cat could catch dozens of mice and rats in one night, saving entire winter supplies from destruction. These feline warriors didn't just hunt, they patrolled. Their mere presence sent rodents scurrying to find easier targets elsewhere. Smart settlers learned to treat their cats like gold, feeding them just enough to keep them healthy but hungry enough to stay motivated. Well, most of the time anyway. But cats weren't the only hunters earning their keep on the frontier. Dogs served as early warning systems, barking frantically when larger pests approached the homestead. They'd chase raccoons away from chicken coops and alert families to rat infestations in storage areas. Some dogs even learned to snap flies out of the air during hot summer afternoons, turning pest control into entertainment. Then there were the feathered cleanup crews that made frontier life more bearable. Chickens and ducks waddled around yards like tiny vacuum cleaners, pecking up flies, ticks, beetles, and just about any bug unlucky enough to cross their path. A flock of chickens could clear an entire yard of crawling pests in a matter of hours. Ducks were especially good at hunting down mosquito larvae in puddles and water troughs, cutting down on the next generation of bloodsuckers before they could take flight. Guinea fowl took bug hunting to another level entirely. These loud spotted birds were like feathered alarm systems that happened to eat everything in sight. They'd devour grasshoppers, beetles, spiders, and even small snakes with enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. The only downside, they never shut up about it. Their constant chatter could drive neighbors crazy, but when locust swarms threatened crops, suddenly everyone wanted guinea fowl on their property. Goats surprised many settlers with their pest-fighting abilities. These hungry animals would eat weedy plants that harbored insects, clearing land while removing pest hideouts at the same time. They'd also munch on poison ivy and thorny bushes that most other animals avoided, creating natural barriers that kept crawling pests away from homes. Plus, goats had zero tolerance for rats trying to share their feed, often stomping or headbutting rodents bold enough to venture too close. Even pigs earned their place in the pest control lineup. These intelligent animals would root around in soil, digging up grubs, beetle larvae, and other ground-dwelling pests that could damage crops the following season. Some farmers discovered that pigs could sniff out and destroy underground nests of harmful insects better than any human ever could. Their powerful snouts turned pest elimination into a treasure hunt. The genius of using animals for pest control went beyond just hunting and eating bugs. These creatures worked in shifts that humans never could. Cats hunted at night when mice were most active. Chickens patrolled during daylight hours when flies and beetles were busiest. Dogs stayed alert around the clock, ready to sound the alarm whenever new threats appeared. Animals also provided pest control in places where smoke and traps couldn't reach. Cats could squeeze into tiny spaces between floorboards and walls where rodents liked to hide. Chickens could access areas under porches and sheds where crawling insects gathered. Ducks could wade into ponds and marshy areas that bred mosquitoes, handling problems right at the source. Let's not forget the psychological warfare these animals provided. Mice and rats are naturally terrified of cats, often abandoning territories just from catching a whiff of feline scent. The sound of chickens clucking and dogs barking created an atmosphere of activity that many pests preferred to avoid entirely. It was like having a 24-hour security system that paid for itself in pest reduction. Some settlers got creative with their animal helpers, training dogs to hunt specific pests or teaching chickens to patrol certain areas at scheduled times. Ranch hands discovered that horses and cattle could be positioned strategically to trample insect-infested areas, destroying pest breeding grounds while going about their normal grazing routines. The economic benefits were impossible to ignore. Animals that provided pest control also supplied milk, eggs, meat, and other valuable products. They turned what could have been a costly pest problem into an opportunity for multiple income streams. A good barn cat didn't just save grain, it paid for itself many times over by preventing food losses that could spell disaster for frontier families. But while animals handled many pest problems with impressive efficiency, some insects required more direct human intervention. The next challenge would be creating clever traps and baits to catch the flying and crawling pests that even the most dedicated animal helpers couldn't quite eliminate completely. Flies buzzing around your dinner table, moths eating your best clothes. Welcome to the Wild West, where every settler had to become a master trap maker just to survive. These weren't fancy store-bought contraptions either. People had to get creative with whatever they could find lying around their homesteads. Glass jars became deadly fly prisons faster than you could say gotcha. Settlers would punch holes in tin lids, fill the jars with sweet syrup or molasses, and watch as flies dove headfirst into their doom. The smell of sugar was irresistible to these pests. Once they crawled through those holes, they were trapped forever. Some families used vinegar mixed with a drop of dish soap instead. The vinegar attracted the flies, but that soap broke the surface tension of the liquid. Down they went, straight to the bottom. Then there's the genius of sticky bands wrapped around tree trunks. Settlers discovered that many crawling insects had predictable travel routes. Ants marched up trees in perfect lines. Beetles climbed bark to reach leaves and fruit. A simple strip of pine tar or sticky sap around the trunk created an invisible wall these bugs couldn't cross. Makes sense, right? They'd get stuck halfway up and become easy pickings for hungry birds. Pan traps were another crowd favorite, especially for flying pests that drove people crazy at night. Fill a shallow pan with water, add a few drops of soap, and place it under a lamp or candle. Moths and flying beetles couldn't resist the light. They'd dive toward the flame, miss and splash into the soapy water below. The soap made sure they sank instead of floating back to freedom. Families would wake up to find dozens of drowned insects floating in their makeshift death pools. But wait, there's more to this story. Some settlers got downright sneaky with their bait choices. Rotten fruit worked like magic for fruit flies and gnats. A piece of overripe apple or a banana peel, left in a jar with a funnel top, created the perfect trap. The insects could crawl in through the narrow funnel opening, but they couldn't figure out how to escape. Their tiny brains just weren't built for problem solving. Meat scraps served as decoys for different types of pests. A small piece of bacon or beef left in the sun would attract flies by the hundreds. Smart homesteaders would place these stinky baits far from their homes, drawing pests away from living areas. Once the flies gathered around the rotten meat, a quick spray of hot water or a swat with a fly swatter could eliminate dozens at once. Let's not forget the morning ritual that every frontier family knew by heart. Trap checking became as routine as milking cows or feeding chickens. Kids would race around the property at dawn, emptying sticky traps, refilling syrup jars, and counting their overnight victories. Finding a trap full of dead bugs meant one thing: fewer bites, less food contamination, and maybe a peaceful night's sleep. The weird part is how competitive this whole trap-making business became. Neighbors would compare their daily catches like fishing stories. I got 47 flies in my molasses jar yesterday. Well, my pine tar strips caught 3 dozen beetles. Families developed secret recipes for the most effective baits. Some swore by adding a splash of beer to their sugar water. Others claimed that a tiny bit of meat grease made all the difference. Seasonal adjustments kept trap makers on their toes. Spring meant setting up ant barriers before the colonies got too established. Summer required maximum fly-catching power during peak breeding season. Fall brought waves of moths looking for warm places to spend winter. Each season demanded different strategies, different baits, and different trap locations. Storage areas needed special attention because grain beetles and weevils could destroy months of food supplies in just days. Settlers learned to place small bowls of flour mixed with boric acid powder near their grain bins. The bugs would eat the poisoned flour and die before they could reproduce. Harsh? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. Weather played a huge role in trap success rates. Rainy days drove more insects toward covered traps. Hot, dry spells made water-based traps extra appealing to thirsty pests. Smart settlers adjusted their trap contents based on weather forecasts, which were basically just looking at the sky and making educated guesses. Even simple materials like cloth strips soaked in sweet liquids became surprisingly effective weapons. Hang these strips from porch ceilings or barn rafters, and flying insects would stick to them like glue. The key was replacing them before they got too disgusting to look at. These homemade contraptions saved families from constant misery, but they were just one piece of the puzzle. While traps caught many pests, other problems required different solutions entirely. Some insects seemed immune to every sweet bait and sticky surface imaginable. That's when frontier families had to get even more creative, turning to materials they could literally find under their feet. While settlers were busy building traps and smoking out mosquitoes, they discovered something amazing sitting right under their feet. Wood ash from their daily fires turned out to be one of the cheapest and most effective pest barriers they could find. Every morning after banking the fire, smart homesteaders would scoop up handfuls of cold ash and sprinkle it like fairy dust around their cabins. The technique was beautifully simple. Fleas absolutely hated crawling through ash because it stuck to their bodies and made jumping nearly impossible. Ants would hit an ash line and turn around like they'd run into an invisible wall. The fine powder got into their breathing holes and between their leg joints, making every step miserable. Better yet, ash was free, abundant, and always available wherever people lived. Farmers quickly learned that their crops could benefit from the same treatment. Potato beetles, those green menaces that could strip entire plants bare overnight, would slow down dramatically when fields were dusted with wood ash. The alkaline powder dried out their soft bodies and made feeding uncomfortable. Some clever settlers mixed ash with a bit of lime or sand to make it even more effective against soft-bodied insects like caterpillars and slugs. Then there was the moat strategy. Families would rake ash in thick rings around their entire cabin, creating what looked like grey halos in the dirt. These barriers worked especially well against crawling pests trying to get inside at night. Beetles, ants and even small spiders would approach the ash line, test it with their front legs, and decide to look for easier targets elsewhere. The stuff was like quicksand for tiny invaders. Sand became another weapon in the pest-fighting arsenal, though it worked differently than ash. While ash was chemical warfare, sand was pure mechanical torture. Farmers discovered that sprinkling coarse sand around young plants created a scratchy obstacle course that soft caterpillars and slugs refused to cross. The sharp grains cut into their tender bellies, making every inch of progress painful. River sand worked best, because it had been tumbled smooth on top, but kept jagged edges that insects could feel. Desert settlers had an advantage here since sand was everywhere, but even prairie families would collect it from creek beds and haul it back in buckets. A light dusting around tomato plants or bean rows could save an entire crop from being devoured by ground-crawling pests. Let's not forget the creative combinations people came up with. Some mixed ash and sand together, creating a double-threat barrier that both dried out insects and scratched them up. Others added crushed eggshells to the mix, making the ground around their plants look like a miniature battlefield. The calcium from the shells even helped plants grow stronger, which was a nice bonus. Inside homes, ash got sprinkled on wooden floors every few days, especially in corners where fleas like to hide. Women would sweep it around with corn brooms, working the powder into cracks between floorboards. The ash absorbed moisture that fleas needed to survive, and made the floor surface too dusty for them to jump effectively. Come cleaning day, everything got swept out and fresh ash went down. Chicken coops received the ash treatment too. Hens naturally loved to dust bathe in ash anyway, so smart farmers made sure there was always a pile available near the roosts. The birds would roll around in it, coating their feathers with the fine powder and suffocating any mites or lice trying to make a living on their skin. It was like watching chickens take therapeutic spa treatments. But here's where things got really interesting. Different types of ash worked better on different pests. Hardwood ash from oak or maple was more alkaline and tougher on soft-bodied insects. Pine ash was lighter and stayed airborne longer, making it perfect for dusting crops. Some families even saved ash from different fires and labeled their buckets like they were running a pest control pharmacy. The timing mattered too. Fresh ash worked better than old ash that had absorbed moisture from the air. Smart settlers learned to collect their ash while it was still slightly warm and store it in covered containers. Morning applications worked best because dew would help the powder stick to plants and pest bodies. Well, ash and sand weren't perfect solutions. Heavy rains washed everything away, meaning constant reapplication during wet seasons. Wind could blow barriers apart, leaving gaps for determined insects to exploit. And in dry areas, too much ash could actually harm plants by making soil too alkaline. Even with these limitations, ash and sand barriers gave frontier families a fighting chance against the endless waves of crawling pests. These simple materials turned every fireplace into a pest control factory, and every sandy creek bed into an ammunition depot. Of course, not every pest problem could be solved by sprinkling powder around. When it came to bigger infestations, Families needed to get their hands dirty with more direct approaches. When all the fancy tricks failed, frontier families rolled up their sleeves and got down to the most basic pest control method imaginable. They picked bugs off their crops one by one, armed with nothing more than their bare hands and sheer determination. This wasn't glamorous work, but it was often the difference between eating and starving through winter. Picture a typical morning on a homestead. The sun barely crests the horizon, and already entire families are marching into their vegetable patches like tiny armies going to war. Children as young as 5 years old toddle between corn rows, their small fingers surprisingly good at spotting fat green caterpillars munching on precious leaves. The adults move methodically through bean plants and potato hills, their eyes scanning for Colorado potato beetles, aphids, and any other uninvited dinner guests. The killing tools were simple but effective. Most families kept old tin buckets filled halfway with kerosene or strong soapy water stationed at the end of each crop row. When someone spotted a pest, they'd pluck it off and drop it straight into the death bath. The kerosene killed insects instantly, while soapy water drowned them slower but just as surely. Some settlers preferred kerosene because it worked faster, but soap was cheaper and easier to make at home. Children actually became the secret weapons in these bug hunts. Their sharp eyes could spot tiny insects that adults might miss, and they could crawl under plants without damaging stems or leaves. Families turned pest picking into competitions, with kids racing to fill their buckets first. The winner might earn an extra piece of cornbread at dinner, or get out of dishwashing duties for a day. Makes sense, right? Turn boring work into a game, and suddenly everyone wants to help. But here's where it gets interesting. Different bugs required different hunting strategies. Grasshoppers were easiest to catch in early morning, when the cool air made them sluggish and slow. Caterpillars hid under leaves during hot afternoons, so hunters learned to flip every leaf and check both sides. Japanese beetles clustered together on rose bushes and fruit trees, making them easy targets for mass removal. The weird part is how much settlers learned about insect behavior through this hands-on approach. They discovered that many pests had predictable patterns. Squash bugs laid their bronze-colored eggs in neat triangular clusters on leaf undersides. Tomato hornworms, despite being huge and green, were surprisingly hard to spot until someone noticed their telltale black droppings scattered on the ground below infested plants. Then there were the indoor pest patrols. Weekly sweeping and cleaning sessions in chicken coops, barns, and storage sheds became family affairs. Everyone grabbed brooms, scrapers, and buckets to wage war against accumulated insects, spider webs, and pest eggs hiding in corners and cracks. These buildings provided perfect winter hideouts for bugs planning spring invasions, so regular cleanouts helped break pest cycles before they got out of control. Well, the timing of these manual removal sessions mattered enormously. Smart settlers learned to schedule their biggest pest hunts right before insects entered their reproductive phases. Kill a female beetle before she lays hundreds of eggs, and you've prevented next month's major infestation. Miss that window, and you're fighting 10 times as many pests later. Some families developed elaborate systems for their hand-picking operations. They'd assign different family members to specific crops or specific types of pests. Mother might focus on the vegetable garden while father handled fruit trees. Older children took responsibility for flower beds and herb patches. Younger kids got the job of checking under porches and around building foundations for beetle hiding spots. The tools evolved beyond simple buckets too. Settlers crafted long-handled spoons for reaching into thorny bushes without getting scratched. They made small brushes for sweeping aphids off delicate plant stems. Some families even created portable pest-catching boxes with tight-fitting lids, making it easier to transport captured insects away from crops before disposal. But why was manual removal so effective when other methods failed? Simple. It was immediate, targeted, and didn't depend on weather conditions or seasonal timing. A smoky fire might blow away in strong wind, and plant-based repellents took time to work. But grabbing a pest and dropping it in kerosene delivered instant results every single time. The social aspect made this tedious work bearable. Families talked, planned their day, and shared observations while hunting bugs together. Children learned to identify beneficial insects that should be left alone versus harmful pests that needed elimination. These morning and evening pest patrols became quality time, even though the work was repetitive and sometimes gross. Of course, handpicking had limits. It worked great for small gardens and manageable infestations, but became impossible when swarms of grasshoppers or other insects arrived in massive numbers. During those crisis situations, settlers needed bigger solutions than individual bug hunting could provide. Yet even when facing overwhelming pest invasions, the knowledge gained from careful manual observation proved invaluable. Understanding bug behavior patterns helped frontier families choose the most effective weapons from their growing arsenal of pest control methods. While frontier families battled bugs with smoke, ash, and handpicking, some turned to more potent solutions. The Wild West wasn't just about cowboys and cattle drives, it was also the testing ground for America's first chemical warfare against insects. These early bug killers packed a punch that would make modern pest control experts nervous. Sulfur became the go-to powder for desperate settlers. This bright yellow substance, often called brimstone, was one of the first commercially available insecticides in frontier towns. General stores stocked it alongside flour and nails. Families would dust their floors, sprinkle it around bed frames, and even mix it into whitewash for cabin walls. The smell, absolutely terrible, like rotten eggs mixed with disappointment. But it worked against fleas, bedbugs, and crawling insects that made life miserable. The application process was simple but messy. Women would tie cloth over their noses and mouths, then scatter sulfur powder in corners, under beds, and along baseboards. Children were sent outside during sulfur days because the dust made everyone cough. Smart families learned to do this on windy days when doors and windows could stay open. Then there's lime, not the fruit but the caustic white powder that burned through just about anything organic. Settlers mixed lime with water to create a harsh solution that dissolved insect eggs on contact. This concoction was painted onto chicken coop walls, poured into ant hills, and brushed around doorways. The mixture ate through bug shells like acid through paper. Problem was, it also ate through skin if you weren't careful. Lye soap took things even further, made from wood ash and animal fat. This soap was strong enough to strip paint. Housewives diluted it with water and sprayed it on plants to kill aphids and caterpillars. The soap suffocated soft-bodied insects, while leaving plants mostly unharmed. But handling pure lye required thick gloves and steady nerves. One splash could cause serious burns. Some of the most creative chemical solutions came from tobacco. Frontier families discovered that steeping tobacco leaves in water created a powerful insecticide. This tobacco tea contained nicotine, which is highly toxic to insects. Gardeners would boil plug tobacco, or cigarette butts, strain the brown liquid, and spray it on crops. The nicotine killed everything from potato beetles to aphids. Of course, it wasn't exactly healthy for humans either, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The weird part is how these tobacco solutions spread through communities. One successful treatment would have neighbors begging for the recipe. Soon entire settlements would smell like wet tobacco during growing season. Cowboys returning from cattle drives often brought back different tobacco varieties specifically for bug-killing experiments. Well, not all chemical experiments went smoothly. Some settlers tried mixing their own concoctions with disastrous results. Combining sulfur with certain oils created toxic fumes that drove families from their homes for days. Others mixed lime too strong and killed their vegetable gardens along with the pests. Trial and error took on deadly serious meaning when your family's food supply hung in the balance. Let's not forget the role of kerosene in frontier pest control. This lamp fuel doubled as an insecticide when mixed with water and soap. The oily mixture clung to insects and suffocated them. Families kept spray bottles filled with kerosene solution for emergency bug attacks. It worked particularly well against flying insects that regular poisons couldn't reach. But using flammable liquid around oil lamps and cook fires required constant vigilance. Mercury compounds occasionally appeared in frontier towns, usually brought by traveling salesmen. These silvery powders promised to eliminate any pest problem permanently. They delivered on that promise along with permanent health problems for anyone who used them regularly. Fortunately, mercury was expensive and rare enough that most families couldn't afford these miracle cures. The most dangerous chemical trend involved arsenic-based powders. By the 1880s, products like Paris green appeared in Western general stores. This bright green powder mixed arsenic with copper to create an incredibly effective insecticide. Farmers dusted it on potato plants to kill Colorado beetles. It worked amazingly well. Unfortunately, arsenic is also amazingly good at killing people. Many frontier families had no idea they were handling deadly poison. But why did these harsh chemicals become so popular despite their dangers? The simple desperation. When grasshopper swarms threatened to destroy entire harvests, or when disease-carrying mosquitoes made children sick, families were willing to risk almost anything. The immediate threat of starvation or illness outweighed long-term health concerns they didn't fully understand. Storage of these chemicals created its own challenges. Frontier homes lacked secure cabinets or proper ventilation. Toxic powders sat next to cooking supplies. Children played near open containers of caustic solutions. Accidents happened regularly, though many went unreported in isolated settlements. These early chemical solutions represented humanity's first serious attempt to fight bugs with science rather than just smoke and prayer. Mixed. Effective pest control paired with unexpected health risks. While settlers celebrated their victories over insects, they were unknowingly setting the stage for much more sophisticated pest control methods that would revolutionize frontier living forever. When most people think of Wild West barbers, they picture mustache waxing and quick shaves between gunfights. The reality, these guys were running the frontier's unofficial delousing stations. Makes sense when you consider that a good haircut was the least of most settlers' grooming problems. Loy's West communities like gossip at a church social. One kid shows up to school scratching, and within a week half the town is doing the same irritating dance. But here's where barbers became unexpected heroes in the war against bugs. Loy's were scissors and a steady hand. Frontier barbers doubled as amateur doctors, pulling teeth, setting bones, and yes, picking nits out of hair for hours at a time. The red and white barber pole actually comes from their medical work, representing blood and bandages. Well, they were definitely seeing plenty of both when dealing with lice-infested scalps. The process was brutal but necessary. A customer would sit in the chair while the barber methodically combed through every strand of hair, hunting for the tiny white eggs that lice leave behind. These nits stick to hair like glue, so removing them required patience and sharp eyes. Some barbers used special fine-toothed combs made of bone or metal. Others just relied on their fingernails and good lighting. But the real weapon against lice was the razor itself. When an infestation got bad enough, complete head shaving became the nuclear option. Entire families would line up at the barbershop for what folks euphemistically called summer cuts. Children cried, adults grumbled, but everyone understood that bald was better than buggy. Then there's the chemical warfare aspect that most history books skip over. Barbers kept bottles of vinegar, kerosene, and various homebrewed concoctions behind their chairs. White vinegar helped dissolve the sticky substance that holds nits to hair shafts. Kerosene killed adult lice on contact, though it also made customers smell like lamp fuel for days afterward. Some barbers got creative with their anti-lice arsenal. They'd mix tobacco juice with lard to create a paste that suffocated bugs. Others swore by sulfur powder mixed with animal fat. The smell was horrible, but desperate times called for desperate measures. And the weird part is, many of these folk remedies actually worked better than you'd expect. Barbershops became community gathering spots where people shared lice-fighting strategies. While waiting their turn, customers exchanged tips about everything from washing hair with lye soap to sleeping with bags of cedar shavings. Information spread as fast as the bugs themselves. Let's not forget that barbers also treated the aftermath of bug battles. Mosquito bites, flea welts, and mysterious rashes were all fair game for the frontier barber's attention. They'd apply salves made from rendered animal fat mixed with various herbs. Some barbers kept bottles of witch hazel or alcohol for cleaning infected bite wounds. The really successful barbers learned to spot different types of infestations just by looking. Head lice left different patterns than body lice. Flea bites clustered around ankles and waistlines. Bedbug bites appeared in neat little rows that folks called breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each pest required its own treatment approach. Children's visits to the barber often turned into educational experiences about personal hygiene. Barbers would lecture their young customers about washing hair regularly, checking for bugs, and not sharing combs or hats. These impromptu health lessons probably prevented more infestations than all the chemicals and remedies combined. But here's what makes the barber's role really interesting. They had to balance pest control with vanity. Nobody wanted to walk around completely bald unless absolutely necessary. Skilled barbers learned to trim hair short enough to discourage lice while still leaving customers with some dignity intact. This balancing act required real artistry. Some barbers specialized in treating entire families at once. They'd close their shops to regular customers and spend whole afternoons working on households hit by major infestations. These marathon delousing sessions could last 6 or 7 hours, with the barber methodically working through every family member from oldest to youngest. The social aspect mattered too. Getting your hair checked for bugs at the barbershop was less embarrassing than admitting the problem to neighbors. Barbers maintained professional discretion about their customers' pest problems. What happened in the barber chair stayed in the barber chair. Payment for these services came in whatever form customers could manage. Cash was scarce on the frontier, so barbers often accepted eggs, vegetables, or promises of future labor. Some barbers built loyal customer bases by offering payment plans for families dealing with persistent infestations. While barbers battled bugs on people's heads and bodies, the women of the frontier were waging their own war against household pests. Their weapons were different, but their determination was just as fierce as any barber's razor. While men were out hunting grasshoppers and building smoke pits, the real war against bugs was happening inside the cabin. Every single day, the housewives of the Wild West weren't just cooking and mending clothes. They were running a full-scale military operation against six-legged invaders. Sarah Thompson woke up at dawn, not because she loved early mornings, but because bedbugs were most active right before sunrise. She'd learned to spot the telltale dark spots on sheets that meant trouble. Her first mission? Strip every bed in the house and haul the linens outside before the critters could scatter. But here's what most people don't realize about frontier housekeeping. It wasn't about making things pretty, it was about survival. A dirty house meant disease, and disease meant death. No pressure there, right? The weapon of choice was hot water. Lots of it. Women would heat massive pots over wood fires, then scrub everything that couldn't run away fast enough. Bedsheets got the full treatment, boiled until the water looked like coffee from all the dead bugs floating on top. Not exactly appetizing, but effective. Then came the beating. Heavy quilts and mattresses were dragged outside and beaten with wooden paddles or thick sticks. The neighbors might hear the constant thwacking and think someone was getting disciplined, but it was actually Mrs. Johnson declaring war on fleas. Each whack sent clouds of dust, debris, and hopefully dead insects flying into the air. Floors received daily attention that would make modern clean freaks jealous. Women swept twice a day, once in the morning to clear overnight visitors, and once at dusk to remove anything that crawled in during daylight hours. The dirt floors common in early cabins got sprinkled with wood ash, which acted like tiny glass shards to soft-bodied insects trying to cross. Let's not forget the laundry routine that bordered on obsession. Clothes weren't just washed, they were inspected, turned inside out, shaken violently, and examined again. Women developed eagle eyes for spotting lice eggs clinging to fabric seams. A single missed knit could restart an entire infestation. The really smart housewives developed what we'd now call integrated pest management, though they just called it common sense. They'd time their cleaning to the bugs' behavior patterns, knew that fleas jumped highest in the afternoon heat, so morning floor scrubbing was most effective, understood that moths preferred dark, undisturbed corners, so those areas got extra attention during spring cleaning. Sunlight became their secret weapon. Everything that could be moved got dragged into direct sunlight for what they called sun treatment. Mattresses, pillows, blankets, even wooden furniture spent hours baking in the heat. Bugs hate extreme temperatures, and the UV rays killed eggs that soap and water missed. But the psychological warfare was just as important as the physical cleaning. These women created environments so hostile to insects that the bugs literally couldn't establish a foothold. Clean surfaces meant nowhere to hide eggs. Constant movement and disruption meant no peaceful breeding grounds. Regular washing eliminated the human scents that attracted parasites in the first place. The weekly routine would exhaust a modern cleaning service. Monday meant stripping and boiling all bedding. Tuesday was floor day, scrubbing with lye soap so strong it could take skin off your hands. Wednesday brought the great furniture moving, where every stick of furniture got relocated so corners could be swept and scrubbed. Thursday was clothing inspection day. Friday meant beating rugs and heavy fabrics. Saturday involved washing down walls with vinegar solutions that made the whole cabin smell like a pickle factory. And the weird part is, they did all this while cooking 3 meals a day, tending gardens, caring for children, and handling a dozen other frontier responsibilities. Modern multitasking has nothing on a frontier housewife armed with a scrub brush and a grudge against bedbugs. The most successful women developed their own signature techniques. Some swore by adding kerosene to wash water, risky but effective. Others used homemade soap so caustic it could dissolve insect exoskeletons on contact. A few innovative souls created early versions of sticky traps using tree sap and strategic placement. Community knowledge sharing was crucial. Women traded cleaning secrets like state secrets. The wife who figured out that tea tree leaves in mattress stuffing prevented mite infestations became the neighborhood hero. Information about which soap recipes killed the most bugs spread faster than gossip about the preacher's wife. Their success rate was impressive considering the tools available. A well-managed frontier household could stay relatively bug-free even when neighboring cabins were overrun with pests. The difference wasn't luck, it was relentless, systematic effort that never stopped. These daily cleaning battles created the foundation for everything else. Families tried to keep bugs at bay, but keeping the house clean was just the beginning. The next challenge was keeping the bugs off their actual bodies, which required a whole different set of strategies and some pretty creative solutions. While frontier families battled bugs in their homes and food supplies, they also faced a more personal challenge. These pests didn't just invade cabins and crops, they made themselves comfortable on human bodies. Keeping insects off people required its own set of tactics, and Wild West settlers developed some pretty clever ways to stay clean and bug-free. Homemade lye soap became the weapon of choice for weekly washing rituals. This wasn't your gentle moisturizing soap from today's stores. Lye soap was harsh stuff made from wood ash and animal fat, strong enough to strip paint off a fence, but it worked. The caustic mixture killed lice eggs, removed built-up sweat that attracted flies, and left skin clean enough to spot new bug problems early. Women would make big batches of this soap, trading bars with neighbors like currency. Bathing happened in streams, rivers, or big metal tubs when water was available. Cold mountain streams were particularly effective because the rushing water physically knocked off ticks, fleas, and other hitchhikers that had latched onto clothing and skin during the day. Smart settlers learned that a quick dip after working in tall grass or around animals could prevent a week of itching and scratching. Hair care took on military precision when it came to pest control. Long, elaborate hairstyles weren't just impractical on the frontier, they were bug magnets. Families kept hair cut short, especially on children, making it easier to spot lice and nits during daily inspections. Mothers would comb through each child's hair with fine-toothed metal combs, checking behind ears and along the scalp where lice loved to hide. Finding even one louse meant immediate action for the whole household. Then there's the surprising truth about perfumes and scented oils. While people back east might douse themselves in floral fragrances, frontier folks learned to avoid strong scents altogether. Sweet perfumes attracted bees, wasps, and mosquitoes like magnets. Even pleasant-smelling hair oils could draw unwanted attention from flying pests. The goal was to smell clean but neutral, letting human scent blend into the background rather than announcing your presence to every bug within 50 yards. Clothing maintenance became a daily outdoor ritual that would look strange to modern eyes. Every morning, settlers would take their clothes outside and give them a thorough shaking and beating. This wasn't just about dust, it was pest patrol. Fleas, ticks, and small beetles could hide in fabric folds overnight, waiting for their next opportunity to bite. A good shake in the fresh air sent most of these freeloaders flying, while vigorous beating with a stick or paddle knocked off the stubborn ones. The weird part is how this outdoor clothes beating became a social activity. Women would gather in yards or common areas, chatting while they shook out dresses, shirts, and undergarments. Children learned to identify different types of bugs that fell out, turning pest removal into an educational game. Some families even kept score of who found the most ticks or fleas, making the chore competitive rather than disgusting. Boots and shoes required special attention since they spent all day in contact with bug-infested ground. Settlers learned to turn boots upside down and shake them vigorously before putting them on each morning. Scorpions, spiders, and various crawling insects loved the dark, warm environment inside leather boots. More than one cowboy got an unpleasant surprise from skipping this simple morning routine. Let's not forget the importance of undergarments in the bug-fighting arsenal. Cotton or linen underclothes acted as a barrier between skin and outer clothing, making it harder for small insects to reach flesh. These undergarments were washed more frequently than outer clothes, often boiled in large pots to kill any eggs or larvae that might be hiding in the fabric. Women learned to check seams and stitching carefully, since these spots provided perfect hiding places for lice and their eggs. Body inspection became as routine as morning coffee. Family members would check each other for ticks after spending time outdoors, focusing on warm spots like armpits, behind knees, and along the hairline. Children were taught to recognize the early signs of flea bites, lice infestations, or tick attachment, turning everyone into amateur medical inspectors. Some settlers discovered that certain activities naturally discouraged bugs from taking up residence on their bodies. Heavy physical work that caused sweating could actually repel some insects, while others were attracted to the salt and moisture. Ranch hands learned to time their most strenuous work for midday, when many biting insects were less active, saving gentler tasks for dawn and dusk when mosquitoes and gnats were hunting. But personal hygiene was just one piece of the puzzle. Even the cleanest, most bug-free people still face challenges when their homes became infested. After major pest outbreaks, some frontier communities learned that their housing itself needed changes to prevent future invasions, leading to some interesting architectural innovations. Bad pest years changed everything. After watching entire crops get wiped out by grasshopper swarms or dealing with bedbugs that made sleep impossible for months, settlers realized their building methods needed serious upgrades. What started as quick fixes to survive the winter suddenly became permanent changes that would define frontier architecture for decades. The most dramatic shift, raising entire homes off the ground. Families who'd lost everything to crawling armies of insects started building on stone blocks, wooden stilts, or even concrete piers. These weren't just small adjustments either. Some houses went up 3 or 4 feet, creating enough space underneath that you could practically walk upright. The logic was simple but brilliant. Make bugs work harder to reach your living space, and most of them won't bother trying. But here's where it gets interesting. That empty space under raised houses became incredibly useful storage. Families discovered they could keep tools, spare wood, and even some food supplies in the cool, dry area beneath their floors. The bugs that did make it up there found mostly things they didn't want to eat anyway. Then there's the storage revolution that swept through settlements after particularly brutal infestation years. Wooden food bins, which had seemed perfectly reasonable before, got tossed out faster than yesterday's newspaper. Metal containers became the gold standard, even though they cost significantly more. Tin, steel, and even repurposed military surplus containers started showing up in pantries across the frontier. Smart families went a step further and moved their storage buildings entirely. Instead of keeping sheds and pantries attached to the main house, they built them 20 or 30 feet away. The thinking was clever: if bugs got into your stored grain or preserved meat, at least they wouldn't automatically march straight into your bedroom. This created the classic frontier layout with the main house, a separate kitchen building, storage sheds scattered around the property, and the outhouse way out back. Whitewashing became obsessively popular after swarm years, and not just for looks. Settlers discovered that many crawling insects avoided bright white surfaces, especially in direct sunlight. Barn walls, shed exteriors, and even foundation stones got regular coats of white paint or lime wash. Some families went overboard and whitewashed everything they could reach, creating settlements that probably glowed like beacons on sunny days. The placement of outbuildings tells a fascinating story about pest psychology. Chicken coops moved farther from houses because families realized flies and mites would travel from the birds straight to the people. Same with pig pens, cow sheds, and even vegetable gardens. Everything got spread out more, creating frontier homesteads that looked almost like small villages instead of tight clusters of buildings. Well water sources got serious protection upgrades too. After discovering that bugs could contaminate wells and cisterns, settlers started building elaborate covers, screens, and even small buildings around their water supplies. Some families constructed entire well houses, tiny structures that existed solely to keep insects, leaves, and other contamination out of their drinking water. Window and door placement changed dramatically. Instead of putting openings wherever was convenient during construction, families started thinking strategically about prevailing winds, sun angles, and bug flight patterns. South-facing windows might get smaller to reduce heat that attracted flies, while north-facing openings got larger to create cooling airflow that discouraged mosquitoes. Interior wall treatments evolved after bedbug disasters. Settlers who'd spent weeks tearing apart log cabin interiors to hunt down every last bug started demanding smoother wall surfaces in new construction. Plaster became more popular, not for comfort but because it eliminated the cracks and gaps where insects could hide. Some families even started using early wallpapers, believing the paste would trap small bugs. Foundation design got remarkably sophisticated. Instead of just stacking stones or logs, builders started creating deliberate barriers. Smooth stone foundations became common because insects couldn't grip the surfaces easily. Some settlers even embedded broken glass or sharp metal fragments in their foundation mortar, creating medieval-style defenses against crawling pests. The spacing between buildings followed unwritten rules that developed after communities watched infestations jump from house to house. Families started demanding at least 50 feet between their main dwelling and their neighbors, believing this distance would slow the spread of fleas, bedbugs, and lice during outbreak years. Roofing materials shifted toward metal whenever possible. Wooden shingles harbored insects, and thatch was basically an invitation for every bug in the territory. Metal roofs were expensive and sometimes hard to get. but they created surfaces that most insects couldn't penetrate or nest in. These architectural changes weren't temporary panic responses. They became the foundation of frontier building codes and influenced how towns developed across the West. Every major pest outbreak taught lessons that got built into the next generation of structures. Speaking of lessons learned the hard way, no amount of clever building design could solve every pest problem. Some insects were so persistent and adaptable that they required constant focused attention to control. Bedbugs fell squarely into this category. Wild West settlers faced many irritating pests, but none were quite as persistent and downright maddening as bedbugs. These tiny blood-sucking creatures turned what should have been restful nights into battles of endurance. Unlike mosquitoes that buzzed around outside or flies that could be swatted away during the day, bedbugs were sneaky little vampires that waited until families were fast asleep before launching their attacks. The worst part, they were masters of hide and seek. Bedbugs squeezed into the tiniest cracks in wooden bed frames, nestled behind loose wallpaper, and made themselves comfortable in mattress seams. During daylight hours they stayed completely hidden, but once darkness fell and people settled into bed, these unwelcome guests emerged for their nightly feast. Families would wake up covered in itchy red welts, knowing they'd been dining companions for creatures they couldn't even see. What made bedbugs especially frustrating was how they spread from house to house. Cowboys and cattle drivers unknowingly carried them in their bedrolls as they traveled from town to town. A single infested traveler could introduce bedbugs to an entire settlement. The bugs would hitchhike on clothing, blankets, and personal belongings, setting up new colonies wherever they landed. Before anyone realized what was happening, whole neighborhoods could be dealing with the same bloodthirsty invaders. Frontier families quickly learned that fighting bedbugs required extreme measures. Boiling water became their weapon of choice. Women would heat large pots of water and pour it directly into the cracks and crevices where bugs might be hiding. The scalding water killed both adult bugs and their eggs on contact, but it had to be done regularly since new bugs could always move in from neighboring hiding spots. Some desperate settlers took even more dramatic action. They used blowtorches or heated metal tools to literally burn bugs out of wooden bed frames. This method was effective but incredibly dangerous in homes built entirely of wood and filled with dry materials. More than one cabin probably caught fire from overzealous bedbug hunters wielding flames near their furniture. Regular bed inspections became a family ritual. Parents and children would completely disassemble their beds every few weeks, examining every joint, crack, and corner for signs of the enemy. They looked for dark spots of bug excrement, bloodstains on sheets, and the bugs themselves. Finding even one bug meant a thorough search of the entire sleeping area, since where there was one, there were usually dozens more hiding nearby. Then there were the clever barrier tactics. Some families painted their bed frames with thick, sticky substances or grease. The idea was that bugs couldn't easily crawl across these slippery surfaces to reach sleeping people. Others placed the legs of their beds in shallow pans filled with water, creating tiny moats that bugs couldn't cross. These methods worked to some degree, but determined bedbugs often found alternative routes like dropping from the ceiling or climbing walls. The psychological toll was just as bad as the physical discomfort. Families would lie awake at night, listening for the slightest sound and feeling phantom crawling sensations on their skin. Children became afraid to go to bed, and adults lost precious sleep that they needed for demanding frontier work. The constant itching from bites made everyone irritable and exhausted during the day. Bedbugs also created social problems in small communities. Families were embarrassed to admit they had infestations, fearing neighbors would think they were dirty or careless. But the reality was that even the cleanest households could get bedbugs through no fault of their own. A single visitor or piece of borrowed furniture could introduce the pests to any home. Some settlements tried community-wide approaches to the problem. They would designate certain buildings as quarantine areas where travelers had to stay before entering the main town. These buildings were regularly treated with smoke, boiling water, or other pest control methods. While not foolproof, these measures helped slow the spread of bedbugs from one location to another. The arrival of metal bed frames in some areas offered new hope. Unlike wooden beds with their numerous cracks and joints, metal frames provided fewer hiding places for bugs. However, metal beds were expensive and not readily available in remote frontier areas. Most families had to make do with homemade wooden beds and continue their ongoing war against the tiny invaders. What's particularly interesting is how bedbug problems actually got worse as towns grew bigger. In crowded boarding houses, hotels, and apartment buildings, the bugs could easily travel between rooms through shared walls and connections. A problem that started in one room could quickly become a building-wide nightmare. But bedbugs weren't the only persistent pests that made settlers' lives miserable. While families battled these nighttime bloodsuckers, they also had to deal with other unwanted companions that were just as determined to share their living spaces. Bedbugs might have been annoying, but lice and fleas were the real nightmare companions of Wild West life. These tiny hitchhikers didn't just visit, they moved in permanently, turning daily existence into a constant battle for basic comfort. Every morning started the same way in most frontier homes. Mothers would grab their fine-toothed combs and begin the daily inspection ritual. They'd work through each family member's hair, section by section, hunting for the telltale white specks that meant trouble. Lice eggs, or nits as they called them, stuck to hair strands like miniature pearls of misery. Finding them early was everything. The combs themselves became precious tools of survival. These weren't fancy store-bought items. Most families carved their own from wood or bone, spacing the teeth just right to catch both adult lice and their eggs. After each use, the combs went straight into boiling water. Some families kept their lice combs in small pots of kerosene between uses, figuring the fumes would kill anything that survived the heat treatment. But here's where it gets interesting. Lice weren't just a family problem. They were a community epidemic waiting to happen. One infested child at the local schoolhouse could spread the problem to every family in town within days. Teachers learned to spot the constant scratching and would send kids home immediately. Schools sometimes closed for weeks while families battled major outbreaks. Then there were the fleas, which presented their own special brand of torture. Unlike lice that stayed put in hair, fleas turned your entire wardrobe into a mobile enemy base. They'd hide in the seams of clothing during the day, then launch surprise attacks when you least expected it. The ankle bites were the worst, dozens of tiny itchy welts that made walking pure misery. Fighting fleas required military-level strategy. Every morning settlers would turn their clothes completely inside out and beat them vigorously with sticks or paddles. The idea was to knock loose any fleas that had taken up residence overnight. Smart families did this beating outside, far from the house, so the displaced fleas couldn't just jump back inside. When regular beating didn't work, desperate times called for desperate measures. Families would strip naked and literally burn their most infested clothing. Sure, it meant losing precious garments in a place where new clothes were hard to come by, but sometimes incineration was the only way to break the cycle. Better to own one clean shirt than 3 flea-infested ones. The washing rituals for lice were particularly intense. Women would boil large kettles of water and add whatever they could find that might help. Lye soap, vinegar, even kerosene in small amounts. Hair got scrubbed until scalps were raw, then rinsed with solutions that burned and stung. Children dreaded these treatments, but everyone understood they were necessary for survival. Tea tree oil became a frontier favorite when families could get their hands on it. The strong scent seemed to repel lice while soothing the constant itching that came with infestations. Some mixed it with lard or bear grease to make it spread easier through hair. Others created their own remedies using pine tar, which smelled terrible but worked surprisingly well. Kerosene treatments were common but dangerous. Parents would rub small amounts into children's hair, then wrap their heads in cloth overnight. The fumes were supposed to suffocate both lice and their eggs. Sometimes it worked, but kerosene near open flames and candles created obvious fire risks that claimed more than a few frontier homes. The social stigma made everything worse. Families with visible lice or flea problems found themselves isolated from community gatherings. Churches would quietly ask infested families to stay home until they got the problem under control. Trading posts sometimes refused service to obviously bug-ridden customers, making it even harder to get supplies needed for treatment. School outbreaks created panic that spread faster than the lice themselves. When one child showed up scratching, parents would keep their kids home for weeks. Teachers learned to inspect students at the door, checking behind ears and along hairlines for signs of trouble. Some schools kept bottles of kerosene and fine combs as standard equipment, like first aid supplies. The cycle seemed endless because reinfection happened constantly. You could spend days treating your family, washing everything, boiling combs and scrubbing hair raw, only to pick up new hitchhikers from the next person you met in town. Travelers, cowboys coming off long cattle drives, and new settlers were often walking lice and flea distribution centers. Well, at least lice and fleas stayed on people and their clothes. But frontier families faced other creatures that turned their carefully tended gardens into buffet tables for hungry insects. The battle was about to move outdoors, where different enemies required completely different tactics. Pioneer women weren't just fighting bugs inside their homes, they were waging war in their gardens too, and they had to get creative fast because losing crops meant going hungry through winter. The smartest settlers figured out that certain plants could actually repel insects naturally. Marigolds became the garden superhero nobody expected. These bright orange and yellow flowers weren't just pretty to look at. They released a smell that made many bugs turn around and head somewhere else. Women would plant marigolds around their tomatoes, beans and squash like little floral bodyguards. Garlic and onions worked the same magic. Plant them near your carrots or lettuce, and suddenly aphids and other soft-bodied insects wanted nothing to do with your vegetables. The strong sulfur compounds that made these plants so pungent to humans made them absolutely disgusting to most garden pests. Pioneer families learned this trick from Native American tribes, who had been companion planting for centuries before settlers arrived. But here's where it gets really clever. Some women created entire border patrols around their gardens using pest-repelling plants. They'd ring their vegetable plots with rows of tansy, mint or catnip. These aromatic herbs formed a natural barrier that confused and deterred many flying insects. The bugs would approach the garden, hit this wall of strong scents and often just give up and fly away. Crop rotation became another secret weapon, though it took time for settlers to figure out why it worked so well. Moving corn from one section of the garden to another each year broke the life cycles of insects that had gotten comfortable feeding on that specific crop. Corn rootworms, for instance, would lay their eggs in soil expecting corn to be there next spring. When they hatched to find beans instead, they'd starve. The weird part is how well this worked even when people didn't understand the science behind it. A woman might notice that her beans grew better after her corn plot, or that moving her squash to a different spot seemed to reduce beetle damage. She'd keep doing what worked, passing these tricks down to her daughters and neighbors. Mulching turned into another brilliant pest control strategy. Settlers would spread straw, dried grass or even newspaper around their plants. This created a barrier that crawling insects like cutworms and slugs had trouble crossing. The mulch also kept the soil moist and cool, which many garden plants loved but certain pests found uncomfortable. Then there were the more unusual companion planting tricks that sound almost like folklore but actually worked. Planting nasturtiums near cucumber and squash plants drew cucumber beetles away from the main crops. The nasturtiums acted like sacrificial decoys, attracting the pests to themselves instead. Some women called these trap crops because they trapped the bugs away from the food plants. Herbs played double duty in these frontier gardens. Basil planted near tomatoes didn't just make for convenient cooking ingredients. It actually improved the tomatoes' flavor while repelling hornworms and aphids. Dill attracted beneficial insects like ladybugs and parasitic wasps that would hunt down garden pests. These helpful insects became unpaid workers in the pest control business. The timing of planting became crucial too. Women learned to plant their most vulnerable crops when pest populations were naturally lower. Late spring plantings might avoid the first generation of certain beetles. Early fall gardens could produce crops after summer pest populations had crashed. Some settlers got really creative with physical barriers made from plants themselves. They'd grow thick hedges of aromatic shrubs like rosemary or lavender around their entire garden plots. These living fences didn't just smell wonderful, they created microclimates that many pests found uninviting while providing windbreaks and habitat for beneficial insects. The most successful frontier gardeners mixed all these strategies together. A typical bug-resistant garden might have marigold borders, garlic planted between vegetable rows, straw mulch covering the soil, and herbs scattered throughout. It looked chaotic compared to modern neat garden rows, but it worked incredibly well at confusing and deterring pests. What made these methods so effective was that they attacked the pest problem from multiple angles simultaneously. Instead of relying on one solution that bugs might eventually adapt to, these gardens presented insects with a constantly changing puzzle of smells, textures and growing conditions that made settling in and reproducing much harder. These plant-based pest control methods weren't perfect, of course. A really determined swarm of grasshoppers could still devastate even the most cleverly planted garden, but for everyday pest pressure from aphids, beetles, caterpillars and flying insects, companion planting gave pioneer families a real fighting chance at protecting their food supply. The knowledge of which plants worked best together spread through communities like valuable gossip. Women would trade seeds and growing tips at church gatherings, sharing discoveries about new plant combinations that seemed to keep bugs away. But even the most bug-resistant garden couldn't protect the settlers' livestock from one of the frontier's most persistent flying tormentors. When the sun started setting across the frontier, something terrible began. Mosquitoes rose from every creek, pond and muddy puddle like tiny vampires ready for their evening feast. But they weren't just after the settlers. Livestock became sitting ducks for these blood-hungry swarms. Cattle and horses suffered the worst. These big animals couldn't swat away clouds of mosquitoes like humans could. Their ears, eyes and bellies became prime targets. The buzzing got so intense that entire herds would stampede just trying to escape the relentless attacks. A single cow could lose so much blood from mosquito bites that it would weaken and sometimes die. Smart ranchers figured out the timing pretty quickly. Mosquitoes were laziest during the blazing midday heat, but turned vicious at dawn and dusk. So livestock got locked up in barns right before sunset. These weren't just any barns though. Ranchers would build small fires inside or right outside the barn doors, creating thick, choking smoke that mosquitoes absolutely hated. The smoke trick worked, but it came with problems. Animals had to breathe that same smoky air all night long. Sometimes the smoke got so thick that horses would cough and wheeze for hours. But a few hours of smoky air beat getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. Then there's the creative protection methods that emerged. Some ranchers wrapped their prize horses in thick wool blankets from neck to tail. The animals looked ridiculous like oversized sheep, but the fabric blocked most mosquito bites. These blankets got soaked in pine oil, grease, or even coal tar, anything with a strong smell that bugs couldn't stand. Pine oil became especially popular because it was easy to find in forested areas. Cowboys would rub it directly on their horses' coats, creating a slippery, smelly barrier.
The downside?
Everything the horse touched would reek for days. Saddles, ropes and riders all picked up that overwhelming pine scent. Well, here's where things get interesting. Some livestock actually developed their own defense strategies. Cattle would roll in dust or mud to create natural armor against bites. Horses learned to stand in smoke from campfires without being told. Smart animals figured out that staying near humans meant better protection from the bug armies. But mosquitoes weren't just annoying, they were deadly. These tiny insects carried diseases that could wipe out entire herds. Texas fever was the worst nightmare for any rancher. Mosquitoes would bite sick cattle, then spread the disease to healthy animals faster than wildfire. A single infected mosquito could kill dozens of cows within weeks. The disease problem made mosquito control a matter of life and death, not just comfort. Ranchers who ignored mosquito protection often lost their entire livelihood in one bad season. Whole families went broke because they underestimated these tiny flying threats. Some of the more desperate solutions got pretty extreme. A few ranchers built giant smudge pots, basically controlled trash fires designed to pump out maximum smoke. These contraptions burned cow dung, wet grass, and green wood for hours. The smoke clouds were so thick, they could be seen from miles away. Neighbors knew exactly which ranch was fighting a mosquito invasion, just by looking at the sky. Let's not forget the timing strategies that really separated successful ranchers from the failures. The smartest ones would move their herds to higher ground during mosquito season. Mosquitoes breed in standing water, so hilltops and ridges offered some relief. Animals grazed in valleys during the day, then got herded uphill before the evening mosquito attacks began. Other ranchers tried the grease approach. They'd coat their animals in thick layers of pig fat, bacon grease, or even axle grease from wagon wheels. The animals looked absolutely disgusting, covered in glistening fat that attracted dirt and debris, but mosquitoes couldn't bite through the greasy barrier, and the weird part is how creative some of these solutions became. One rancher in Kansas allegedly trained his cattle to follow smoke signals. When mosquitoes got bad, he'd light specific fires, and the entire herd would move toward the smoke without any human guidance. Whether that story is completely true, or just frontier legend, it shows how seriously people took mosquito warfare. The battle against mosquitoes also created some unexpected community cooperation. Neighboring ranchers would coordinate their smoke schedules, creating massive smoke barriers that protected multiple properties. These smoke walls could stretch for miles, turning entire valleys into no-fly zones for mosquitoes. By the late 1800s, some of the wealthier ranchers started importing mosquito netting from back east. They'd drape huge nets over feeding areas and water troughs, creating bug-free zones for their most valuable animals, but most frontier families couldn't afford such luxuries. The fight to protect livestock from mosquitoes was just one piece of a much larger puzzle though. While ranchers battled bugs in the barns, families inside their homes were waging their own war against nighttime pests with an entirely different set of weapons. When nighttime fell in the Wild West, the real battle began. Mosquitoes swarmed through cracks in cabin walls like tiny vampires hunting for blood. Families had two choices: suffer through sleepless nights covered in welts, or get creative with whatever fabric they could find. Cheesecloth became a lifesaver for many frontier families. This lightweight cotton mesh was originally meant for straining milk and making cheese, but desperate parents quickly discovered it worked wonders draped over cradles and beds. Mothers would carefully tuck the cloth around sleeping children, creating protective cocoons that kept the worst biters at bay. The fabric was cheap, easy to wash, and light enough that even sweltering summer nights became bearable. But cheesecloth wasn't the only option. Muslin fabric, slightly thicker and more durable, served families who could afford it. Some settlers even repurposed old wedding veils or damaged curtains. Anything with a tight weave that let air through while keeping bugs out became precious cargo. The real trick was keeping these makeshift nets intact. Mosquito netting in the Wild West took a beating from daily use, rough handling, and the constant threat of tears. Kids would accidentally poke holes with their elbows. Cats would claw through the fabric chasing moths. Even careful adults would snag the delicate material on rough wooden bed frames. Smart families developed repair routines that would make modern seamstresses proud. Women carried small sewing kits specifically for net maintenance. They'd patch holes with scraps of similar fabric, sometimes creating patchwork designs that looked almost decorative. These nets were mended so many times, they resembled quilts made of different materials stitched together. Then there's the matter of hanging these nets properly. Frontier beds weren't designed for mosquito protection. Most families had simple wooden frames with straw or corn husk mattresses. Creating a proper net required ingenuity that would impress any engineer. Some hung their netting from ceiling beams using ropes or leather strips. Others fashioned crude canopy frames from bent willow branches or scrap wood. The goal was creating enough space inside the net for comfortable sleep while ensuring no gaps where determined mosquitoes could sneak through. Well, not every family slept indoors during bug season. When cabin interiors became unbearably hot and stuffy, some brave souls moved their beds outside. Sleeping under the stars sounds romantic until you factor in the insect armies waiting to attack. Outdoor sleepers became masters of the mosquito net setup, creating elaborate tent-like structures that could withstand prairie winds. These outdoor arrangements required serious planning. The netting had to be anchored securely to prevent it from blowing away or collapsing during the night. Stakes, rocks, and even pieces of furniture became anchor points for these temporary bedroom fortresses. But here's where things get interesting. In regions where malaria and yellow fever ran rampant, mosquito nets literally meant the difference between life and death. Families in humid river valleys or marshy areas knew that one infected mosquito bite could spell disaster. Their net maintenance wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. The irony wasn't lost on many settlers. They'd traveled west seeking freedom and adventure, only to spend their nights trapped inside fabric cages to avoid tiny flying enemies. Some wrote letters back east describing the bizarre ritual of tucking themselves into nets each evening like they were going into battle. Window screens slowly started appearing in more prosperous frontier towns during the late 1800s. These weren't the smooth metal screens we know today. Early versions were crude affairs made from whatever mesh material could be stretched across wooden frames. Some used the same cheesecloth that protected beds. Others experimented with fine wire mesh when it became available through mail-order catalogs. Homemade window screens required constant adjustment. The frames would warp in hot weather. The mesh would sag or tear from wind pressure. But families who managed to install even basic screens noticed immediate improvements in their sleep quality and overall health. The real challenge came during the hottest months when keeping windows closed wasn't an option. Families had to choose between sweltering heat with screens or cool breezes with bugs. Many developed rotation systems, screens during mosquito peak hours around dusk and dawn, open windows during the middle of the night when bug activity decreased. And the weird part is how these simple fabric barriers created unexpected social changes. Families with good mosquito nets got better sleep, which meant better health and productivity. Children in well-protected homes had fewer illness-related absences from school. Adults could work longer hours without the exhaustion that comes from mosquito-plagued nights. Some entrepreneurial settlers even started small businesses repairing and creating custom mosquito nets for their neighbors. These traveling net fixers became surprisingly popular in communities where store-bought options weren't available. Makes sense, right? When your survival depends on keeping bugs away, even the simplest solutions become incredibly valuable. Of course, nets and screens only worked when the surrounding environment cooperated. Standing water and trash piles could turn any protective barrier into a losing battle against overwhelming insect armies. Mosquito nets and homemade screens could only do so much when the real problem was sitting right outside your door. Towns across the Wild West were finally learning a hard lesson. Bugs don't just appear out of nowhere, they breed. And where they breed best is in all the nasty, stagnant places people create without thinking twice about it. The 1880s brought a wave of municipal housekeeping that would have made your grandmother proud. Town councils started passing ordinances that basically said, clean up your mess or pay a fine. These weren't suggestions either. Marshals walked around with citation books, looking for standing water, trash piles, and anything else that might turn into a bug factory. Standing water was enemy number one. Every old tin can, broken bucket, or wagon wheel rut that filled with rainwater became a mosquito nursery. A single puddle could produce hundreds of mosquitoes in just a few days during summer. Towns required property owners to drain or fill any water that sat still for more than a week. Some places went further. They banned certain containers entirely from being left outside. Then there were the waste piles. People had gotten into the habit of just tossing garbage wherever it landed. Potato peels, coffee grounds, and scraps of meat created perfect fly breeding grounds. The smell alone could knock you over, but the real problem was what hatched from those rotting heaps. New ordinances required households to burn their organic waste at least twice a week or haul it to designated dump sites outside town limits. Privies presented their own special challenge. Most folks had built their outhouses wherever seemed convenient, often too close to wells, kitchens, or neighbors' property lines. Flies loved these spots and would travel back and forth between waste and food preparation areas. Towns started requiring minimum distances at least 50 feet from any water source and 100 feet from kitchens when possible. Some communities even mandated that privies be moved to new locations every few years. Community cleanup days became regular events, almost like holidays. Everyone would turn out with rakes, shovels, and wheelbarrows to tackle the accumulated mess. These weren't just feel-good gatherings either. They were survival tactics disguised as social events. Families would compete to see who could clear the most debris or fill the most holes. Kids got rewards for finding and emptying water containers. The burning days were something to see. Towns would designate specific dates when everyone brought their accumulated trash to central locations for massive bonfires. These fires burned hot and long, consuming everything from rotten food to old rags that might harbor insect eggs. The smoke could be seen for miles, and neighboring settlements often coordinated their burn days to avoid overwhelming any single area with ash and fumes. Well, the rules didn't stop there. Some towns got creative with their pest-fighting ordinances. Abilene required all grain merchants to sweep their loading areas daily and dispose of spilled grain before sunset. Dodge City made it illegal to leave animal carcasses within city limits for more than 24 hours. Tombstone actually fined people for letting weeds grow higher than 12 inches on their property. Tall grass meant hiding spots for ticks and chiggers. Enforcement could be tricky though. Not everyone appreciated being told how to manage their property, especially by officials who might be newcomers themselves. Some folks ignored the rules until they got hit with fines they couldn't afford. Others grumbled but complied because they'd seen what happened during bad mosquito years when entire families came down with fever. The funny thing about these early sanitation laws is how they accidentally solved other problems too. Cleaner streets meant fewer rats, which meant less damage to stored goods. Drained puddles reduced not just mosquitoes but also the muddy conditions that made walking around town miserable after every rainstorm. Better waste disposal cut down on the stray dogs and wild animals that wandered into settlements looking for easy meals. Some communities took things further with public works projects. They built drainage ditches to channel rainwater away from populated areas. Others constructed covered trash bins that kept waste contained until burn days. A few ambitious towns even started early versions of garbage collection, with designated individuals responsible for hauling waste to dump sites. Not every attempt worked perfectly. Drainage ditches sometimes created new mosquito problems if they didn't flow properly. Covered bins could become breeding grounds themselves if they weren't cleaned regularly, and community burn days occasionally got out of hand, with fires spreading beyond their intended boundaries. But the basic principle was sound: eliminate the conditions that bugs need to thrive, and you eliminate many of the bugs. These ordinances represented a shift from just reacting to pest problems to actually preventing them. Towns were learning to think like their enemies, identifying weak spots before they became major infestations. Of course, even the cleanest towns still had to deal with seasonal invasions that arrived from outside their boundaries. When swarms of grasshoppers descended from the plains, no amount of municipal housekeeping could prepare settlers for what was coming next. The summer of 1874 started like any other on the Kansas prairie. Farmers tended their corn and wheat, families planned for harvest season, and children played in fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Then, on a clear July morning, something appeared in the western sky that would haunt these settlers for generations. A dark cloud rolled across the plains, but this wasn't rain coming their way. The air began to buzz with a sound like distant thunder that never stopped. As the shadow grew larger, people squinted upward and realized the horrible truth: grasshoppers. Millions upon millions of them, creating a living storm that blotted out the sun. These weren't the little green hoppers kids chased through meadows. Rocky Mountain locusts measured nearly 3 inches long, with powerful jaws and an appetite that defied belief. When they descended on a farm, the feeding frenzy began immediately. Corn stalks that had taken months to grow disappeared in minutes. Wheat fields turned into bare dirt faster than a man could walk across them. The sound was unbearable. Imagine standing inside a giant popcorn machine while someone shook it violently. That constant crackling, crunching noise as millions of insects devoured everything in sight drove people to cover their ears and run indoors. But even thick cabin walls couldn't muffle the terrifying symphony of destruction happening outside. Mary Henderson, a farmer's wife near Dodge City, later wrote that the hoppers ate her entire vegetable garden while she watched from her kitchen window. "They stripped my tomato plants so clean, I thought someone had pulled them up by the roots," she recalled. "Then they started on the wooden handles of our farm tools." That's right, these hungry insects didn't stop at crops. They gnawed through leather harnesses, wooden wagon wheels, and even the wool clothing hanging on wash lines. Families discovered grasshoppers had chewed holes through their winter coats, boots, and blankets. One settler claimed they ate his saddle so thoroughly that only the metal buckles remained. Towns organized desperate defense efforts that sound almost comical today, but represented life or death struggles for survival. The grasshopper drives became community events where everyone participated, from grandparents to toddlers. Families would form long lines across infested fields, beating pots and pans while driving the insects toward deep trenches dug specifically for this purpose. Once thousands of hoppers fell into these ditches, someone would pour kerosene over them and light the whole mess on fire. The smell was horrific, like burning fish mixed with rotten eggs, but it was one of the few weapons that actually worked. Some towns dug trenches that were 6 feet deep and stretched for miles, creating grasshopper graveyards that smoldered for weeks. Children became expert hopper catchers, competing to see who could fill buckets fastest with the writhing insects. They'd dump their catches into barrels of soapy water or coal oil, drowning thousands at a time. Schools closed during the worst infestations, not because buildings were damaged, but because kids couldn't walk to class without being overwhelmed by the swarms. Farmers tried covering their remaining crops with anything available. Bed sheets, canvas tarps, and even quilts were stretched over potato patches and bean rows. The lucky few who owned enough fabric to protect their gardens sometimes saved small portions of their harvest. Most weren't so fortunate. When regular swatting and burning proved insufficient, communities got creative with their warfare tactics. Some built enormous bonfires upwind of their fields, hoping the smoke would drive the hoppers elsewhere. Others tried creating noise barriers by organizing brass bands to march around their property lines, playing as loudly as possible. The grasshoppers seemed unimpressed by musical performances. Railroad companies hired crews specifically to clear tracks of dead hoppers. Trains would slide to dangerous stops when wheels hit piles of crushed insects that made rails as slippery as ice. Telegraph lines snapped under the weight of grasshoppers, using the wires as convenient resting spots between feeding frenzies. After the main swarms moved on, farmers faced another nightmare: the eggs. Female grasshoppers had buried millions of eggs in the soil before departing, ensuring next year's invasion would be even worse. Smart settlers burned their fields completely, hoping the flames would destroy the hidden egg masses before winter set in. Some families gave up entirely and headed back east, unable to face another potential grasshopper summer. Others stayed and prepared for war, stockpiling kerosene, digging advanced trenches, and organizing neighborhood watch groups to spot incoming swarms early. The 1875 season brought fresh horrors as predicted, but communities had learned valuable lessons about cooperation and rapid response. What they couldn't have predicted was how these grasshopper battles would eventually lead to the first commercial pest control products reaching frontier towns. Companies back east were watching these prairie wars closely, developing new weapons for the next phase of the bug-fighting revolution. The grasshopper swarms of the 1870s changed everything. After watching their crops disappear in hours, desperate farmers were ready to try anything that promised relief. Enter the first commercial pest control products, a mix of genuine innovation and dangerous quackery that would reshape how people fought bugs forever. Paris Green became the superstar of early bug killers. This bright emerald powder contained arsenic and copper, making it deadly to potato beetles that had been destroying crops across the frontier. Farmers loved how quickly it worked. You'd dust it on your potato plants in the morning, and by evening dead beetles covered the ground like tiny armored casualties. The problem? Paris Green didn't just kill bugs. This stuff was so toxic that farmers started getting sick from handling it. Livestock died after grazing near treated fields. Children playing in dusted gardens ended up in bed with mysterious illnesses. But here's the twisted part. People kept using it anyway because it actually worked. When your family's survival depends on saving the potato crop, you might accept some risk. Companies capitalized on this desperation with wild advertising claims. Patent medicine salesmen hawked bottles of pest destroyer and bug death at traveling shows, promising to solve every insect problem from bedbugs to barnflies. Most of these concoctions contained arsenic, lead, or other heavy metals mixed with flour or chalk to bulk them up. One popular product called Rough on Rats advertised itself as safe for household use. The label cheerfully suggested sprinkling it around kitchen corners and pantries. What they didn't mention was that this innocent-looking powder contained enough strychnine to kill a horse. Families used it liberally, not realizing they were turning their homes into toxic zones. Then there were the spray solutions. Early bug sprays came in glass bottles with hand pump applicators that looked more like perfume dispensers than pesticides. Professor Johnson's insect annihilator claimed to kill every flying pest in your home with just a few squirts. The secret ingredient was usually kerosene mixed with soap and whatever cheap chemicals the manufacturer could find. These sprays worked. Sort of. They did kill bugs on contact. They also filled houses with toxic fumes that made people dizzy and nauseous. More than one frontier family spent the night sleeping outside after enthusiastically spraying their cabin only to discover they'd made it unlivable. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and some products actually helped. Pyrethrum powder, made from dried chrysanthemum flowers, became popular because it killed insects without immediately poisoning humans. Smart farmers figured out they could grow their own chrysanthemums and make their own bug powder, cutting out the middleman entirely. The really clever entrepreneurs started selling bug-proof storage containers. Metal bins with tight-fitting lids promised to keep weevils out of grain supplies. These actually worked better than most chemical solutions and didn't risk poisoning the food inside. Some companies even offered money-back guarantees, which was revolutionary thinking in an era of snake oil salesmen. Sticky traps became another commercial success story. Companies sold sheets of paper coated with a substance that trapped flies and crawling insects. These tanglefoot papers could be hung around kitchens and barns, slowly filling up with captured pests. Unlike poisonous powders, sticky traps were relatively safe and actually did what they promised. Mail-order catalogs started featuring entire sections devoted to pest control products. Sears and Montgomery Ward sold everything from sulfur candles for fumigating rooms to specialized dusting equipment for applying bug powders to crops. Rural families could suddenly access pest control tools that had previously been available only in big cities. The strangest products were the electric bug zappers that started appearing in the 1890s. These crude devices used battery power to create small electrical shocks, supposedly killing insects that touched metal grids. They rarely worked as advertised, but they looked so scientific and modern that people bought them anyway. Some companies got creative with combination products. Dr. Miller's Pest Away soap promised to kill lice while you washed your hair. Henderson's Bug on liniment claimed to repel mosquitoes while soothing sore muscles. Most of these multi-purpose products did neither job particularly well. The real game changer was the development of spray equipment. Hand-pumped sprayers allowed farmers to apply liquid pesticides over large areas quickly. This technology made commercial bug-fighting products much more practical than the old methods of dusting crops by hand or burning smudge pots. Of course, regulation was practically non-existent. Companies could claim anything about their products without proving effectiveness or safety. This led to some spectacular disasters when overconfident farmers followed label directions for products that were essentially industrial poisons. By the late 1800s, a whole industry had grown up around pest control, complete with traveling salesmen, mail-order catalogs, and local distributors. The age of do-it-yourself bug fighting was slowly giving way to manufactured solutions, but commercial products weren't the only indoor pest battle happening. Inside frontier homes, a different kind of warfare was taking place in kitchens and pantries, where families developed ingenious tactics to protect their most precious resource. After dealing with outdoor swarms and bedroom invaders, frontier families faced their biggest daily battle right in their own kitchens. The pantry wasn't just where food lived, it was ground zero for an endless war against hungry insects, sneaky rodents, and anything else that wanted a free meal. Keeping food safe meant getting creative with storage. Forget modern refrigerators or airtight containers. Pioneer women had to outsmart bugs using whatever they could find. Cheesecloth became their best friend. They'd wrap flour sacks, dried beans, and cornmeal in layers of this thin fabric, then hang everything from ceiling beams like edible chandeliers. Why hang it up? Simple, mice can't climb air, and most crawling insects gave up when they couldn't reach their target. Glass jars were precious as gold when families could get them. Every empty pickle jar or medicine bottle got a second life storing sugar, salt, or dried herbs. The trick wasn't just sealing things up tight. Smart housewives learned to check the rim of every jar for tiny cracks where weevils might sneak through. One microscopic gap could doom an entire winter's worth of flour. Then there's the daily cleanup routine that would make modern neat freaks look lazy. Pioneer women swept kitchen floors multiple times each day, not because they were obsessive, but because a single dropped crumb could summon an army of ants by morning. Every speck of food debris got collected and burned in the stove. Nothing went to waste and nothing stayed on the floor long enough to attract visitors. Vinegar became the ultimate multi-purpose weapon. A quick wipe down of wooden counters and shelves with vinegar kept ants from establishing their invisible highways through the kitchen. The smell might have been sharp, but it beat finding a parade of insects marching toward the sugar bowl. Some women mixed vinegar with water and sprayed it around cabinet corners where bugs like to hide during the day. But here's where things got really interesting. The art of the ant chalk line. Before fancy ant baits existed, frontier women discovered that certain substances created invisible barriers insects wouldn't cross. They'd draw lines of powdered chalk, ash, or even ground cinnamon around pantry shelves. Ants would march right up to these lines, then turn around like they'd hit an invisible wall. Nobody understood why it worked, but it did. Flour presented special challenges because weevils seemed to appear out of nowhere. These tiny beetles could turn a perfectly good sack of flour into a writhing mass of bugs seemingly overnight. The solution? Bay leaves. A few dried bay leaves tucked into flour sacks kept weevils away without affecting the taste of bread or biscuits. Women would also freeze flour during winter months, not in freezers, but by leaving sacks outside on particularly cold nights to kill any hidden eggs. Coffee grounds found new life as pest deterrents around kitchen areas. Used grounds sprinkled near doorways and windowsills created a barrier that many insects avoided. The bonus? Kitchens smelled like coffee instead of vinegar or ash. Some families saved every coffee ground for months, drying them out and storing them specifically for bug control. Storage creativity reached impressive heights when dealing with dried meat and fish. These protein sources attracted not just insects but also mice and rats. The answer was hanging meat in cloth bags treated with pepper or other strong spices. The fabric breathed enough to prevent mold, while the spices kept most pests at bay. Some families built special smokehouses just for storage, where the lingering smoke smell continued deterring bugs long after the fires died out. Rice and beans required their own strategies. Small stones or marbles mixed in with dried beans made it harder for weevils to burrow deep and lay eggs. When it came time to cook, women would pour everything into water. The beans sank while the stones and any dead bugs floated to the top for easy removal. Kitchen windows became battlegrounds during summer months. Before proper screens existed, women hung strips of sticky paper or cloth near windows to catch flies before they reached food preparation areas. Some made their own fly paper using pine sap or molasses spread on brown paper strips. Disgusting but effective. The most dedicated housewives developed inspection routines that would impress military sergeants. Every few days they'd pull out stored food items, checking for signs of infestation. Tiny holes in fabric bags, strange smells or unexpected movement meant immediate action. Contaminated food got burned, Containers got scrubbed with lye soap and everything started over. But even the most careful kitchen management couldn't prepare families for what happened when pests targeted their clothing and precious belongings. Moths, silverfish and carpet beetles had their own sneaky ways of destroying the things families treasured most. Moths were the silent destroyers of the Wild West, and they had an appetite for everything settlers held dear. These sneaky little creatures didn't announce their arrival with buzzing or biting. They just quietly chewed their way through wool blankets, Sunday best suits and precious winter coats while families slept. A single moth could lay hundreds of eggs in the perfect hiding spot, inside a folded wool shirt or tucked deep in a blanket chest. The real damage came from their babies. Tiny caterpillars that munched through fabric like it was their personal buffet. Families would unfold a stored dress only to find it looking like Swiss cheese. Makes sense why people called them clothes moths, right? But moths weren't the only fabric destroyers causing headaches. Carpet beetles, silverfish, and various other tiny invaders saw clothing as lunch. These pests loved dark, undisturbed spaces where wool, cotton, and leather goods sat unused for months at a time. A family's entire wardrobe could be ruined in one bad season. The real problem was that clothing wasn't cheap or easy to replace on the frontier. Most families owned maybe 3 or 4 outfits total. Losing a winter coat to moths could mean freezing through the cold months. A ruined Sunday dress meant showing up to church in work clothes, which was socially embarrassing in tight-knit communities. Cedar became the hero of clothing storage. Settlers quickly learned that cedar chests weren't just pretty furniture, they were bug-fighting machines. The natural oils in cedar wood repelled moths and other fabric-eating insects. Families saved up to buy cedar chests, or they lined regular wooden boxes with cedar shavings when money was tight. Then there were the lavender ladies. Women who stuffed small cloth bags with dried lavender flowers and tucked them between stored clothes. Lavender's strong scent confused moths and made them look elsewhere for egg-laying spots. Some families grew entire lavender patches just for clothing protection. The smell was pleasant for humans but absolutely terrible for hungry insects. Leather goods faced their own unique challenges. Boots, saddles, gun holsters and harnesses attracted different pests than fabric did. Leather beetles loved to burrow into untreated hides, and certain moths specialized in eating animal products. Worse yet, leather could develop mold in humid conditions which attracted even more insects. Smart settlers oiled their leather regularly with neat's foot oil, bear grease or other animal fats. This kept the leather supple and created a barrier that bugs didn't want to cross. Oil treatment also prevented cracking, which could create perfect hiding spots for insects to lay eggs. Airing out clothes became a seasonal ritual. Families would drag everything outside on sunny days and shake each item vigorously. Sunlight killed moth eggs and larvae that were hiding in fabric fibers. The shaking dislodged any bugs that were already making themselves at home. Women hung clothes on lines for hours, sometimes beating them with wooden paddles to knock out stubborn pests. Storage location mattered just as much as storage method. Clothes kept in damp basements or humid attics were sitting ducks for insect damage. The best storage spots were cool, dry, and away from walls where moisture might seep in. Some families hung clothes from ceiling beams in the middle of rooms to keep them away from wall-dwelling insects. Regular inspection was the only way to catch problems early. Women developed eagle eyes for tiny holes, strange dust, or small moving specks that indicated bug activity. Finding damage early meant saving most of the garment. Waiting too long meant complete destruction. The weird part is how creative people got with homemade repellents. Some stuffed newspaper between stored clothes because ink was supposed to repel insects. Others sprinkled black pepper, cloves, or dried mint leaves in storage areas. Whether these folk remedies actually worked is debatable, but desperate times called for creative solutions. Professional cleaning wasn't an option for most frontier families, so they invented their own methods. Hot summer days meant spreading clothes on rocks to literally bake any insects hiding inside. Some families built special drying racks that positioned clothes over smoky fires to fumigate them naturally. Mending became a survival skill because of pest damage. Women learned to patch holes so skillfully that repairs were nearly invisible. Thread was precious, so every salvageable piece of fabric got multiple lives through creative patchwork. The frustrating thing about clothing pests was how they spread between households. Visiting families could accidentally carry moths or beetles in their clothes to new homes. Community gatherings sometimes became pest-swapping events without anyone realizing it. But clothing damage was just one way pests affected daily life on the frontier. While settlers battled moths in their closets, they also had to deal with beneficial insects that brought their own complications and opportunities right to their doorsteps. Wild honeybees were everywhere in the American frontier, and settlers had complicated feelings about these buzzing neighbors. One day you'd be grateful for their sweet honey. The next you'd be running from an angry swarm that decided your barn was prime real estate. These weren't the gentle, managed bees we know today. Wild colonies were fierce, unpredictable, and absolutely essential for survival. Honey was liquid gold on the frontier. It preserved food, sweetened bitter medicines, and could be traded for supplies. But getting it, that was a whole different story. Finding wild bee colonies became an art form. Settlers would follow bee lines, the straight flight paths bees took back to their hives after collecting nectar. Smart pioneers would catch a few bees, dust them with flour to make them easier to spot, then release them, and follow the white specks through the trees. Some families became legendary bee hunters, tracking down colonies miles from their homesteads. The tricky part was actually getting the honey without getting stung to death. Early beekeepers didn't have fancy protective suits or smokers. They relied on thick clothing, wide-brimmed hats, and whatever they could burn to create calming smoke. Cow dung worked well, so did rotten wood, dried grass, or corn cobs. But here's where things got interesting and dangerous. Wild bee colonies didn't always stay put where settlers found them. Swarming season turned peaceful bees into flying clouds of chaos. A swarm might suddenly decide your cabin's wall cavity was perfect for their new home, and then you had thousands of bees living inside your house. Getting them out was a nightmare. Some folks tried smoking them out, which sometimes worked and sometimes just made the bees angrier. Others would wait until night when the bees were less active, then try to remove sections of wall to access the hive. The lucky ones could convince the swarm to move on by making enough noise and smoke that the bees decided to find quieter accommodations. Then there were the bee stings. Most people could handle a few stings, but some settlers had severe reactions that could kill them. Without modern medicine, a bad allergic reaction meant swelling, breathing problems, and sometimes death. Families learned to identify who among them couldn't handle bee stings, and kept those people far away during honey collection. Early beekeeping wasn't sophisticated. Settlers built simple log hives, basically hollow logs with wooden covers, and hoped wild swarms would move in. Some got creative with clay pots, wooden boxes, or even large baskets covered with mud. The goal was creating a space bees would find attractive while still allowing humans to harvest honey without destroying the entire colony. Smart beekeepers learned bee behavior through trial and error. They discovered that bees were less aggressive on warm sunny days when flowers were blooming. Cloudy, cold days made bees irritable and more likely to attack. Evening harvests were popular because many worker bees were still out foraging, leaving fewer defenders at the hive. Harvesting honey was messy, sticky work. Settlers would cut out sections of honeycomb, crush it to release the honey, then strain it through cloth to remove wax and bee parts. The leftover wax was just as valuable. It waterproofed leather, sealed cracks in cabins, and made candles that burned cleaner than tallow. But honeybees created unexpected problems too. Bears loved raiding beehives, and a bee colony near your homestead was basically sending dinner invitations to every bear in the area. Some settlers had to choose between keeping bees and dealing with regular bear visits that could destroy gardens, frighten livestock, and threaten family safety. The honey itself could be a pest magnet. Anthers, flies, and other insects were drawn to anything sweet, so storing honey required careful planning. Settlers learned to keep honey in sealed containers, sometimes buried underground or hung high in trees where other pests couldn't reach it. Wild bee colonies also meant dealing with other stinging insects. Wasps and hornets often built nests near bee colonies, and settlers couldn't always tell the difference until they got close. Yellow jacket nests hidden in the ground were particularly dangerous. Step on one while following a beeline, and you'd get swarmed by insects with nothing sweet to offer in return. Some pioneering families became skilled enough to manage multiple hives, essentially becoming the frontier's first commercial beekeepers. They'd trade honey and wax with neighbors, traveling merchants, and nearby towns. A productive hive could provide steady income for families struggling to make frontier life profitable. Despite all the challenges, most settlers considered wild bees worth the trouble. Honey was one of nature's perfect foods. It never spoiled, provided quick energy, and made terrible-tasting frontier medicine bearable. The wax solved dozens of household problems, from waterproofing to light sources. While families were mastering the delicate dance with honeybees, they faced an entirely different kind of threat from the insect world. Some bugs didn't just steal food or make life uncomfortable. They carried diseases that could kill entire communities, turning tiny pests into genuine threats to survival. Mosquitoes weren't just annoying in the Wild West. They were killers. One bite from the wrong mosquito could put you in bed with malaria for weeks. Settlers didn't understand germs yet, but they knew swamp air and certain bugs brought sickness that could wipe out entire families. Yellow fever hit port towns and river settlements like a hammer. People called it Yellow Jack because victims turned yellow before they died. The disease spread fastest in summer when mosquitoes swarmed thickest. Whole neighborhoods would empty out as families fled to higher ground, leaving behind everything they owned. Then there's typhoid fever, spread by common houseflies. These weren't just the flies buzzing around your dinner table being annoying. They were landing on human waste, then hopping straight onto your bread and butter. Every meal became a gamble. Families who kept the cleanest kitchens still got sick because flies traveled between houses faster than gossip. Dysentery followed the same path. Flies picked up bacteria from outdoor privies and carried it directly to food. The disease caused severe diarrhea that could kill within days, especially children and elderly folks. During hot summers, entire wagon trains would be forced to stop for weeks while people recovered or died. But wait, it gets worse. Lice carried typhus, a disease that spread like wildfire through crowded settlements. When families huddled together during harsh winters, sharing beds and clothing, typhus epidemics exploded. The disease caused high fever, terrible headaches and a distinctive rash. People called it camp fever because it hit military posts and mining camps hardest. Schools became breeding grounds for lice outbreaks. One infected child could spread typhus through an entire classroom within weeks. Teachers learned to inspect students' heads daily, sending home anyone with nits. Some schools closed for months during bad outbreaks, leaving children behind in their education. Let's not forget about rats and their fleas. While the Great Plague outbreaks didn't hit the American frontier until after 1900, smaller plague cases appeared earlier. Rats arrived on supply wagons and ships, bringing their disease-carrying fleas along. The fleas would bite infected rats, then jump to humans when the rats died. Trading posts and supply stores attracted rats like magnets. These places stocked grain, flour, and dried goods that rats loved. When plague-infected rats died, their fleas desperately searched for new hosts. Store owners and customers became easy targets. Mining camps faced unique disease challenges. Men lived in cramped quarters with poor sanitation. Body lice spread rapidly through shared clothing and bedding. Typhus outbreaks could shut down entire mining operations, costing companies thousands of dollars in lost production. Cattle drives created mobile disease disasters. Cowboys slept on the ground for months, rarely washing their clothes or bodies. Lice, fleas, and ticks accumulated over long journeys. When drives reached towns, these pests jumped to local residents, starting new disease outbreaks. Railroad construction camps weren't much better. Workers lived in temporary shacks near swamps and standing water. Mosquitoes bred in massive numbers around these camps. Malaria became so common that railroad companies factored disease losses into their budgets. Frontier doctors had few weapons against insect-borne diseases. They couldn't see bacteria or understand how insects spread illness. Most treatments involved bleeding patients or giving them harsh purgatives that often made things worse. Many people died not from the original disease, but from the cure. Some communities developed their own disease-fighting strategies through trial and error. Towns that drained swamps and standing water saw fewer malaria cases. Settlements that enforced strict cleanliness rules during lice outbreaks contained typhus better. But these successes happened by accident, not scientific understanding. Churches and schools often closed during disease outbreaks. Community gatherings spread illness faster than anything else. Funeral attendance became risky business when typhus or typhoid struck. Some towns banned large gatherings entirely during epidemic seasons. Women bore the heaviest burden during disease outbreaks. They nursed sick family members while trying to protect healthy children. Many mothers died from diseases they caught while caring for others. Entire households could lose their caretakers, leaving young children orphaned. Disease outbreaks shaped settlement patterns across the West. Areas known for yellow fever or malaria stayed sparsely populated. Healthy locations attracted more settlers, growing into larger towns. Real estate values reflected disease risk, long before anyone understood the connection. The economic impact was staggering. Sick workers couldn't farm, mine, or build. Businesses lost customers during outbreaks. Supply chains broke down when teamsters fell ill. Some promising settlements failed entirely after disease wiped out too many residents. Military posts faced constant disease pressure. Soldiers lived in close quarters, sharing everything from cups to blankets. When lice or disease-carrying insects invaded barracks, entire companies could be put out of action. Some frontier battles were decided more by typhus than tactics. Recovery from major disease outbreaks took years. Families had to rebuild after losing breadwinners. Communities struggled to replace lost teachers, doctors, and skilled workers. The psychological trauma lingered long after the physical symptoms disappeared. Understanding the connection between pests and disease would eventually transform frontier life, but that knowledge came slowly and at a terrible human cost. Fighting bugs in the Wild West wasn't a solo mission. When grasshoppers descended like biblical locusts or rat infestations threatened entire grain supplies, individual families quickly realized they needed backup. The frontier taught people many harsh lessons, but perhaps none more important than this. Some battles require an army. Towns across the West developed what they called pest drives, organized community hunts that brought together dozens of families for a common cause. These weren't casual weekend activities. They were serious military-style operations with designated leaders, specific roles, and battle plans that would make a general proud. When word spread that grasshoppers were marching toward the settlement, church bells rang and everyone dropped their regular work. The grasshopper drives of the 1870s became legendary examples of frontier cooperation. Entire communities would form long lines stretching across fields, beating pans and driving the insects toward massive trenches filled with burning brush. Children carried buckets of kerosene while adults wielded brooms, shovels, and anything else that could move bugs. Some drives lasted 3 days straight, with families taking shifts to keep the pressure constant. But grasshoppers weren't the only target. Rat hunts became seasonal events in many settlements. Every family would contribute to a central bounty system, maybe a penny per tail or a nickel for every 10 dead rodents. Kids turned these hunts into competitions, racing between barns and storage sheds with terrier dogs and homemade clubs. The family that brought in the most rats often won prizes like extra flour or a bolt of fabric. Then there were the organized cleanup days that tackled breeding grounds before pests could establish themselves. Towns would declare trash-burning Saturdays where everyone hauled garbage, old lumber, and standing water containers to central bonfires. These events doubled as social gatherings. Families would bring food and make it a community picnic while destroying mosquito nurseries and fly breeding spots. Some settlements got creative with their bounty systems. Montana town offered school children a penny for every 100 flies they could catch and count. Teachers would verify the totals and pay out rewards from a community fund. Kids developed elaborate trapping systems using bottles, sticky paper, and bait stations around their homes. The competitive spirit turned pest control into a profitable summer job. Church socials became unexpected centers for pest control knowledge sharing. Women would trade recipes for homemade bug sprays alongside their cooking tips. Men compared notes on the best wood-ash mixtures for ant barriers while discussing cattle prices. These gatherings created informal networks where successful pest-fighting techniques spread rapidly through entire regions. The weird part is how these community efforts evolved into formal government action. Towns started passing ordinances requiring property owners to eliminate standing water and maintain clean premises. Failure to comply could result in fines or even forced cleanup at the owner's expense. What began as voluntary cooperation became legally mandated public health measures. Some communities established pest-fighting equipment that families could borrow. Towns might own large bellows-style dusting machines for applying sulfur or lime to gardens. Families could sign up for time slots to use communal smoke pots or professional-grade traps. This sharing system meant expensive pest control tools reached more households without breaking individual budgets. Traveling peddlers began timing their visits around community pest problems. When locust swarms hit the Kansas plains, salesmen would arrive weeks later with specialized traps, poisons, and protective gear. These merchants learned to follow pest patterns like migrating birds, showing up exactly when desperate communities needed their products most. The most successful community programs combined immediate action with long-term planning. After major infestations, town meetings would analyze what worked and what failed. They'd adjust building codes, modify storage requirements, and plan preventive measures for the following season. These post-battle reviews helped communities learn from their mistakes and improve their defenses. Religious communities sometimes organized pest prayer meetings that combined spiritual appeal with practical action. After asking for divine intervention against the latest bug invasion, congregations would organize work parties to implement earthly solutions. Faith and fly swatters went hand in hand on the frontier. Well, not every community effort succeeded perfectly. Personality conflicts, resource disputes, and competing priorities sometimes undermined pest-fighting cooperation, but the settlements that learned to work together consistently outperformed those where families fought bugs in isolation. The success of these community approaches didn't go unnoticed by people with bigger ideas. Entrepreneurs and government officials began studying frontier pest control cooperation, looking for methods that might work on larger scales. These observations would eventually influence how entire regions and states approached pest management in the coming decades. What started as desperate neighbors helping each other survive grasshopper swarms was quietly evolving into something much more sophisticated and far-reaching than anyone could have predicted. By the 1890s, something new started showing up in Wild West towns: professional pest fighters. These weren't your neighbor with a fly swatter, or the local barber picking lice. These were actual businesses advertising their services with fancy signs and bold promises. The exterminator trade grew fastest in railroad towns and mining camps where money flowed more freely. Denver, San Francisco, and even smaller hubs like Dodge City began seeing traveling pest specialists roll into town with wagons full of mysterious equipment. Their methods, well, that's where things got interesting. Most professional exterminators relied heavily on smoke treatments. They'd seal up buildings with canvas tarps and pump in thick, choking clouds of sulfur smoke or burning tobacco. The process could take hours, and families had to clear out completely. But the results impressed people who'd been battling bedbugs and roaches with nothing but boiling water and prayers. Then there were the poison specialists. These operators mixed arsenic compounds, strychnine and other deadly chemicals into baits and powders. They knew exactly how much rat poison to sprinkle in a grain warehouse without contaminating the food. At least, they claimed to know. The reality was more hit or miss than their advertisements suggested. Some exterminators focused purely on trapping. They arrived with dozens of specialized contraptions: wire cages for rats, sticky boards for roaches, and elaborate fly traps that looked like miniature torture devices. These trap specialists could clear out a saloon's mouse problem in a week, something that might take a bartender months to accomplish on his own. But here's the catch that kept most frontier families doing their own pest control: the cost. Professional exterminators charged what amounted to a month's wages for a thorough treatment. A single visit to fumigate a general store might cost more than most settlers spent on supplies in half a year. Makes sense why DIY methods stayed popular, right? The fees weren't the only problem. Many early exterminators were frankly charlatans. They'd blow into town with impressive-sounding titles like Professor of Pest Sciences or Certified Vermin Specialist, but their actual knowledge came from trial and error rather than any formal training. Some caused more damage than the bugs they were hired to eliminate. One traveling exterminator in Colorado became notorious for burning down 2 buildings while attempting smoke treatments. Another in Kansas poisoned an entire family's water supply with his revolutionary ant elimination system. Word of these disasters spread quickly through frontier communities, making people skeptical of professional help. Let's not forget the legitimate operators who actually knew their business. These skilled exterminators brought real innovation to pest control. They introduced timing techniques, hitting rat populations during specific breeding cycles for maximum impact. They understood seasonal patterns that most homeowners missed completely. The best professional pest fighters also served as traveling educators. They demonstrate proper trap placement, explain why certain baits worked better than others, and teach families how to spot early signs of infestations. Some even sold simplified versions of their tools, creating a middle ground between expensive professional service and pure do-it-yourself approaches. Medical practitioners started getting involved too. Traveling doctors began offering treatments for serious insect-related health problems: infected bedbug bites, lice-induced skin conditions, and reactions to spider or scorpion stings. This medical angle gave pest control a more scientific reputation. Barbers expanded their services as well. Many frontier barbers already dealt with lice removal, but professional pest control created opportunities for specialization. Some barbershops became unofficial headquarters for community pest information, with barbers keeping detailed records of which treatments worked best for different problems. The weird part is how territorial these early exterminators became. Professional pest fighters would sometimes sabotage each other's work or spread rumors about competitors using dangerous methods. The competition could get nasty, especially in prosperous mining towns where the potential profits were highest. By the late 1890s, larger towns started demanding higher hygiene standards from businesses. Hotels, restaurants, and boarding houses faced pressure to maintain pest-free environments or risk losing customers. This created steady work for professional exterminators and pushed the industry toward more reliable methods. The professional pest control business also created the first specialized tools that regular families could never afford or obtain. Heavy-duty fumigation equipment, industrial-strength poisons, and precision trapping devices that required expert knowledge to operate safely. But most frontier families continued handling pest problems themselves. Professional exterminators remained expensive luxuries available mainly to wealthy merchants, successful ranchers, and established businesses. The average homesteader still relied on smoke, traps, and elbow grease. What's fascinating is how this early professional pest control industry laid groundwork for modern practices. Many techniques pioneered by frontier exterminators, integrated pest management, targeted chemical applications, and systematic monitoring still influence how we handle pest problems today. The arrival of professional pest fighters marked a turning point in frontier life. For the first time, dealing with bugs wasn't just a personal survival skill everyone had to master. It was becoming a specialized trade with its own expertise and standards. These professional methods eventually filtered down to regular families, creating a bridge between old frontier remedies and the modern approaches that followed. Those smoke-filled nights fighting mosquitoes weren't just desperate measures, they were laying the groundwork for pest control methods we still use today. Walk through any modern garden store, and you'll find companions that would make a frontier housewife smile with recognition. Take mosquito netting for instance. The same cheesecloth barriers that protected sleeping children in log cabins now save millions of lives worldwide. The World Health Organization distributes bed nets across Africa, using virtually identical principles those prairie families figured out in the 1800s. Simple cloth, properly hung, still beats high-tech gadgets when it comes to stopping disease-carrying mosquitoes. But here's where it gets interesting. Modern science has actually proven many of those old wives' tales were spot-on accurate. Remember those marigolds and garlic plants frontier gardeners swore by? Turns out they were biochemistry geniuses without knowing it. Marigolds release compounds called thiophenies that genuinely repel nematodes and other soil pests. Garlic produces sulfur compounds that make insects literally turn around and fly the other way. The companion planting tricks passed down at church socials have become university research subjects. Scientists now study exactly why certain plant combinations work so well together. Those frontier families who planted basil near their tomatoes weren't just following tradition. They were using natural pest management that modern organic farmers pay consultants to teach them. Window screens represent another direct line from Wild West innovation to modern necessity. Those first homemade screens cobbled together from whatever fabric families could spare evolved into the mass-produced mesh that covers billions of windows today. The basic concept hasn't changed one bit. Keep the bugs out, let the air in. Community cleanup days that frontier towns organized to fight pest outbreaks became the foundation for modern public health laws. When those early settlements banned standing water and required trash removal, they were creating the first versions of health codes that govern every city today. The connection between community hygiene and pest control that those prairie towns learned the hard way is now written into law. Animal helpers remain just as valuable now as they were then. Modern permaculture enthusiasts rediscover the pest-fighting power of guinea fowl, chickens, and cats that frontier families knew by necessity. Integrated pest management, the fancy term for using multiple natural methods together, is essentially what every Wild West household was already doing to survive. Then there's the smoke method. While we've moved beyond burning cow dung in our living rooms, the principle lives on in modern mosquito control. Cities still use fogging machines that create dense clouds to knock down mosquito populations. The delivery system got more sophisticated, but the basic idea of using airborne particles to control flying insects traces right back to those smudge pots. Even the harsh chemical solutions have left their mark. Paris Green and other early commercial pesticides taught us crucial lessons about the dangers of overusing toxic substances. The environmental movement of the 1960s grew partly from recognizing problems that started with those first arsenic-based bug killers. Modern integrated pest management emphasizes using the smallest effective intervention, wisdom born from learning what happens when you go too far with chemicals. The manual removal methods live on too. Organic farmers still handpick pests just like frontier families did. The bucket and kerosene technique has evolved into more humane catch and relocate methods. But the basic approach of physically removing unwanted insects remains a cornerstone of sustainable agriculture. Perhaps most importantly, those frontier families established the mindset that multiple approaches work better than single solutions. They combined physical barriers, natural repellents, beneficial animals, community cooperation, and targeted removal because no single method could handle the complexity of pest problems. Modern pest management has come full circle to embrace this same philosophy after decades of trying to find single silver bullet solutions. The botanical knowledge those settlers accumulated has become the foundation for natural pesticide research. Essential oils from cedar mint and other plants that frontier families use to repel insects are now studied in laboratories and formulated into commercial products. The plants haven't changed. We've just gotten better at extracting and concentrating their active compounds. What's remarkable is how many of these old methods are experiencing a renaissance among people seeking alternatives to synthetic chemicals. Diatomaceous earth, which works similarly to the ash and sand barriers frontier families used, has become a popular natural pest control option. The principle of using physical barriers to damage or deter insects has ancient roots that those Wild West families tapped into instinctively. These weren't just quaint folk remedies. They were practical solutions developed under pressure by people who couldn't afford to fail. Their trial and error experiments created a knowledge base that modern science continues to validate and refine. The next time you see someone using companion planting or beneficial insects for pest control, remember they're following a playbook written by families who fought the same battles with far fewer resources, but plenty of determination and creativity. The Wild West wasn't just about gunfights and cattle drives. Every single family out there fought a daily war against an enemy that never retreated: bugs. From the moment settlers stepped off wagons onto frontier soil, insects became unwanted neighbors who refused to leave. Think about it for a second. These pioneers faced challenges we can barely imagine today. No grocery stores, no hospitals, and definitely no pest control companies to call when things got ugly. Yet somehow they survived swarms that could strip fields bare in hours and mosquito clouds thick enough to suffocate livestock. What's remarkable is how creative desperation made them. When grasshoppers threatened to destroy everything they'd worked for, entire communities grabbed pots and pans to beat the insects into trenches of fire. When bedbugs took over their homes, families dismantled beds piece by piece, hunting down every last pest with boiling water and blowtorches. The ingenuity never stopped. Housewives turned laundry day into warfare, using scalding water and harsh lye soap as weapons. Farmers discovered that planting marigolds and onions could create natural fortress walls around their crops. Even barbers became unexpected heroes, pulling lice from scalps and treating mysterious rashes that appeared overnight. But here's what gets overlooked in most history books. These weren't just minor annoyances. Bugs could literally kill you. Mosquitoes carried malaria that left entire families bedridden for weeks. Flies spread typhoid from outhouses to dinner tables faster than gossip. Lice brought typhus that closed schools and churches. One bad pest outbreak could wipe out a settlement's food supply or spread disease that claimed lives. The sheer variety of threats would overwhelm us today. Weevils destroyed stored grain. Moths chewed through precious wool clothing. Flies jumped from person to person during church gatherings. Ticks dropped from trees onto unsuspecting travelers. And don't even get started on the bedbug infestations that followed cattle drives from town to town. Yet families adapted with whatever they had. Smoke became their first line of defense. Thick, choking clouds from burning cow dung that kept mosquitoes at bay during brutal summer evenings. Plant oils rubbed on skin offered temporary relief from bites. Cats earned their keep by hunting mice that threatened winter food supplies. The really clever tricks came from trial and error. Sprinkling wood ash on floors confused ants trying to follow scent trails. Hanging food in cheesecloth bags from ceiling beams kept it safe from crawling invaders. Metal containers replaced wooden barrels after too many beetle disasters. Raised floors stopped armies of insects from marching straight into homes. Communities learned to work together when individual efforts failed. Mass grasshopper drives required every able-bodied person to beat the insects toward burning trenches. Bounty systems paid children to collect harmful bugs by the handful. Church socials became information exchanges where families shared successful remedies and warned about new pest threats. The transition from homemade solutions to commercial products happened gradually. By the 1890s, companies started selling arsenic-based powders and mysterious bug sprays. Paris green became famous for killing potato beetles, even though it was dangerous enough to poison the people using it. Early exterminators appeared in larger towns, charging fees that most families couldn't afford. What's fascinating is how many of those desperate Wild West solutions actually worked. Modern science has proven that companion planting really does deter harmful insects. Essential oils from plants do repel mosquitoes and flies. Smoke remains effective against flying pests. Even the community cleanup efforts that frontier towns organized became the foundation for modern public health laws. The legacy runs deeper than most people realize. Today's mosquito netting in developing countries uses the same principles that protected frontier children. Organic gardeners still plant marigolds and garlic to keep bugs away from vegetables. Screen doors and windows, now standard everywhere, started as frontier innovations born from necessity. Those early settlers didn't have the luxury of calling professionals when pests invaded. They couldn't run to stores for specialized products. Everything depended on observation, experimentation, and sharing knowledge with neighbors. Survival meant becoming an expert on insect behavior whether you wanted to or not. The story reveals something important about human adaptability. When faced with constant threats from tiny enemies, frontier families developed solutions that were often more effective than anything available in established cities back east. They turned household items into weapons, transformed animals into allies, and created community defense systems that protected entire settlements. Looking back reveals a truth that's easy to forget. The Wild West wasn't conquered just by tough individuals with guns and determination. It was won by families who learned to outsmart insects that could destroy crops, spread disease, and make life miserable. Their battle against bugs required constant vigilance, endless creativity, and the kind of cooperation that built lasting communities from nothing but dirt and hope.